Welcome to the Fantasy Audiobook. American Comics. The beginning of the fusion of the motherland. Chapter 21. The small gate of Xavier Manor. A black car slowly drove out, turned around a small road, and merged into the main road. Soon he became part of the constant flow of traffic and didn't attract anyone's attention. Riven, where are we going? In the passenger seat, Luo Shaw glanced at the middle-aged uncle who was driving and asked. Go find someone. While Rui Wen turned the steering wheel skillfully like an experienced driver, she answered casually, as long as he is willing to help, we can find out where Xiao is. Rorschach was really surprised when he heard this. It sounds like the guy Raven is looking for is a great guy with a lot of energy. But the Black Emperor's background is also very big. You must know that the Hellfire Club is not just a pure mutant organization, but also includes other ordinary humans. To be precise, some important figures in society. For example, Howard Stark once received an invitation to join the Hellfire Club. Otherwise, how could the Black Emperor control the situation between the United States and the Soviet Union and single-handedly precipitate the Cuban Missile Crisis? This kind of thing that turns one's hands into clouds and one's hands into rain cannot be accomplished by just some mutants. The Black King's ability to find out about the CIA's secret base of mutants is a good example. So Luo Shaw still remained skeptical about the person Ruiwen mentioned. Ruiwen, who are we looking for? Is he reliable? Rorschach couldn't help but asked confirmingly, it's better to figure out this kind of thing. Don't worry, that guy is one of us. Raven stepped on the brakes and changed her words, he can sense our kind. Sensing other mutants. Rorschach was stunned for a moment, and a name flashed through his mind. You're not talking about Caliban, are you? Rorschach could only think of this person as a mutant with such special abilities. You know him too. Ruiwen was still a little surprised. I didn't expect it to be Caliban. I don't know him. I just heard of this person by chance. Luo Shaw shook his head, but he was determined in his heart. Caliban can sense the presence of other mutants, and as Raven said, as long as Caliban is willing to help, he can immediately find where Shaw is. Naturally, we can also determine whether Xiao has found out where everyone is hiding. That guy is actually so famous. Although Ruiwen was slightly surprised, she didn't think much about it. Rorschach himself is also in the circle, so it is not strange to hear some rumors from his compatriots. Riven, since you know Caliban, then Charles should also know him, right? Then why did Charles never mention Caliban when he was recruiting mutants these days? Rorschach found this a bit strange. Since Caliban lives not far from his hometown, with Charles's temperament, there is no reason to miss him. It was because Charles knew Caliban that Charles knew there was no way Caliban would join us. That guy never trusts anyone, and he only cares about money. He is also very sensitive. You will know when you see him. Raven gave Rorschach a few simple explanations. Rorschach didn't ask any more questions. He only remembered that this character appeared once in Apocalypse, and his ability to sense mutants also had a limited range, which seemed to be only 25 miles. It's not an important role. Rorschach didn't bother to pay attention. After driving 4 thoroughfares, Raven finally slowly parked the car outside a bar. When I was very young, before I met Charles, I relied on my own abilities to transform into various people and steal things from various places. I stole money, food, clothes, everything, but even so, I was still often hungry, and many times I had to sleep in the sewers. One time when I was sleeping in the sewers, I met Caliban who was also sleeping in the sewers. But even then, Caliban never believed me. Raven and Rorschach walked towards the door of the bar while introducing Rorschach. It's so sad. Rorschach sighed sincerely. I don't know if I'm talking about Raven or Caliban. So Rorschach, if you see Caliban later, let me talk to him, okay? Mystique made such a request to Rorschach. Naturally, Rorschach would not have any objections. He could still figure out who was taking the lead in this operation. Rorschach's purpose is actually very clear from beginning to end, just to try his luck and see if he can trigger the mission, nothing more. The two of them happily reached an agreement. Go into the bar. There were people in 2s and 3s drinking and chatting in every seat, and the atmosphere was so lively. Rorschach and Raven came to the bar as if there was no one around. A man was sitting there with his head down, drinking one after another. What do you two want to drink? Behind the bar, a young man in his 30s who looked very smart and capable greeted Rorschach and Raven with a professional smile. "Where's Henry?" Ruiwen frowned slightly and couldn't help but ask. The bartender in front of her was not the bartender she was familiar with. She was not sure whether the person in front of her knew about Caliban. The guest turned out to be a regular customer here. "Here's the thing. Henry is my uncle. He's sick. I'll cover for him for a few days," the young bartender explained to Raven. "Is Henry okay?" Raven didn't think much and asked about Henry's situation. "I hope he's okay, poor uncle. He accidentally flashed his waist. Although he kept saying it was a trivial matter, you know, people of his age are no longer young men like me." The young man shrugged and teased his uncle. "Poor Henry, may God bless him." Raven exchanged greetings with the other party and then got down to business. "Is he here?" "Who are you talking about?" The young bartender was obviously stunned for a moment, not knowing who the him in Ruiwen's mouth was. "Let him in." At this time, a big man walked out from an entrance backstage and shouted to the young bartender. It was obvious that Caliban already knew that Raven was coming. Raven nodded to the young man's wine glass, and then walked with Rorschach towards the entrance to the backstage. Naturally, the young bartender didn't stop him. "Another whiskey." At this time, the man sitting on the bar shook the empty wine glass in his hand at the young man's glass. Rorschach glanced at the other party subconsciously as he stood up to leave. This glance didn't matter. Rorschach discovered that this was actually a very important person. Howard Stark. It must be Howard Stark. Rorschach's eyes suddenly lit up. How could someone of Howard Stark's status and position come to such a cheap tavern? Could it be that the playboy has taken a fancy to a girl and came here to wait for her? Rorschach couldn't help but think with a bad taste in his heart. After all, Howard Stark is even more philandering than his son Tony Stark. This guy doesn't even let go of his friend's wife. He's just a beast. No, at this time, S.H.I.E.L.D. should have been established, right? Howard won't come here to perform any mission, right? When Rorschach thought of this, he was not sleepy at all. If something really happened, it might trigger some missions or something. "Raven, I was thinking, if Caliban is really so sensitive, maybe it would be a good decision for me to wait for you outside." Rorschach paused and made a decision immediately. Going to find Caliban or something, how can it be better than keeping an eye on Howard Stark? "Okay, Caliban is inside, I'll go talk to him, you wait here." Raven didn't think much, nodded and agreed. Rorschach found a seat and sat down casually, and asked for a glass of wine to pretend. On the surface, he was drinking alone, but in fact he was secretly paying attention to Howard Stark. And this attention really discovered something. "Sir, it's been more than 2 hours, will that guy really show up?" The young bartender was working as if nothing had happened, but he said to Howard Stark calmly. No wonder old Henry took a sick leave. It turned out that this young bartender was actually an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. "He will," Howard Stark replied with certainty. "The Soviets will never let traitors go, especially scientists like him. No one can protect him except us." "Why hasn't he appeared yet?" The young bartender put a cleaned cup back into the cup holder. In a situation like his, it is understandable to be cautious. Howard Stark maintained a very optimistic attitude towards this. "Okay, work with peace of mind. Maybe he has already appeared and is just observing the situation in secret." "Understood, sir." The silent and low communication between the two sides ended. They thought that in such a noisy environment, no one would hear a few words in a low voice. But they didn't know that a hacker had sneaked into the scene. A traitor from the Soviet Union, a scientist. Rorschach's thoughts turned and he quickly thought of a person. Could it be that Howard Stark was talking about Anton Vanko, the father of Ivan Vanko, who would whip Ivan Vanko in the future? If you calculate the time point, it is almost this time. But if the person Howard Stark was waiting for was really Anton Vanko, then he could be regarded as witnessing history, right? I just don't know if this incident can trigger any task. Rorschach didn't know this, so he could only wait and try in secret. Squeak. The door of the tavern was opened again, and at this time a middle-aged man walked in. Naturally, no one else in the tavern would pay much attention to a rough man. But Howard Stark at the bar couldn't help but look excited. The person who came was their target. Anton Vanko. I said he would show up. Howard Stark smiled lightly in a tone of everything under control, drank the wine in the glass, and strode towards Anton Vanke. He didn't forget to show off even when carrying out such an important task. "Hey, Charlie, why are you here just now?" Howard Stark walked towards Anton Vanke with a smile on his face, and greeted him like an old friend. "Don't mention it, Hans, the vampire. I had clearly finished waxing, but he insisted that I hadn't done it and asked me to do it again." The two of them chatted while coming to a remote corner. Howard Stark. Until this time, Anton Vanke began to confirm the other party's identity. "Of course it's me. I'm so famous, it's easy to investigate. Don't tell me you didn't check me before you came to see me," Howard Stark said arrogantly. "I checked it, but I can't be sure if you were someone else's disguise." Anton Vanke shrugged, but disguise is also easy to expose. Anton Vanke asked Howard Stark a very profound academic question. Howard Stark answered fluently, and Anton Vanke was completely relieved. "Now, can I see what I want?" Now it's Howard Stark's turn to inspect the goods. Anton Vanke took out several sheets of paper that he had prepared long ago from his clothes. Howard Stark glanced at them quickly and nodded with great satisfaction. On it was a very important research report on energy by Anton Vanke. With this research, Howard Stark's idea about the arc reactor these days can become a reality. Although the academic report was only half, with Howard Stark's level, he could naturally tell it was true. "Okay, let's go." Howard Stark put away the research report very rudely, then stood up and asked Anton Vanke to leave together. But at this moment, a man with a beard suddenly stood up. He took out a gun and pointed it directly at Anton Vanke, ready to pull the trigger. Did Anton Vanke really think that he would be fine after escaping to New York? "Be careful." A waiter in the tavern noticed this keenly, and immediately jumped towards Howard Stark and the other man. He instantly threw the other party to the ground. At the same time, he also took out a gun and fought back against the bearded man. Bang bang bang. The harsh sound of gunfire resounded throughout the tavern. The scene was immediately in chaos, and everyone fled out in panic. But Rorschach did not move. Because at this time, Rorschach's system panel had updated some content as he wished. New mission generated. The mission is as follows. Protect Howard Stark intact and unharmed. Mission reward. 50 origin points. 50 origin points. Rorschach was shocked on the spot. This time the origin points were too few. When he killed the saber-toothed tiger, he still had 100 origin points. This time, he only had half of that time. But considering the current situation, well, it's just dealing with some weaklings, the reward really can't be too high. Bang bang bang. Inside the tavern, the SHIELD agents and the assassins of Ivan Vanko, who had been hiding for a long time, no longer pretended to be disguised, and quickly entered a fighting state, pouring bullets from their firearms at the opponent fiercely. "Sir, follow me." In this chaotic state, the bartender came to Howard Stark's side, covered the two of them, and quickly evacuated to the door. Bang bang. Several rounds of bullets were fired, and an enemy rushed over quickly, trying to block Howard and others from leaving. The bartender quickly pushed Howard and Howard under the table, and suddenly pulled the trigger on each other. Bang bang bang. The bartender shot 3 times in succession, and all 3 shots hit the assassin's chest. I don't know why, but those assassins don't seem to be professional agents, and their marksmanship is far worse than those from SHIELD. "Sir, let's go." After the bartender killed the assassin with 1 shot, he planned to continue taking Howard Stark away. But at this moment, bang bang, 2 more shots were fired, and 2 bullets shot directly through the bartender's body. The bartender's eyes widened and he turned to look at the man who shot him. He couldn't believe his eyes. Why did that guy get shot 3 times and nothing happened? Why, after 3 shots, the opponent's chest was stained red with blood. According to the bartender's experience, the other party would just fall to the ground and slowly lose consciousness and then die. What's going on? But at this moment, no one could answer the bartender's question. Because his consciousness began to blur, he fell directly to the ground. Toms. Howard Stark just lay on the ground and didn't dare to get up. He looked at the bartender lying next to him with a look of regret on his face. Bang bang bang. But at this time, a series of bullets were fired, so scared that Howard Stark quickly retracted his head. Never dare to show up again. Forehead, forehead. And in this moment, other SHIELD agents also fell one after another. The number of assassins was actually not too large, only 3. But for some reason, all of those assassins were weaklings who could not be killed. Even if he is shot, he will not be affected at all. It was precisely because of this that the 3 assassins didn't care about other people's bullets. They just refused to dodge and shot mercilessly at those SHIELD agents one after another. This resulted in a large number of casualties among SHIELD agents. The situation at the scene can be said to be extremely critical. Mr. Stark. But at this time, a voice suddenly sounded. Howard Stark turned around and saw an extremely young face appearing in front of him. It's dangerous here, leave quickly. Their target is not you, leave now. Howard Stark shouted anxiously to Rorschach. Howard was not surprised that Rorschach recognized him. As he said, he was also a celebrity. It doesn't matter if someone recognizes him or something. Leave these people to me, but during this period, I want you to lie here and don't act rashly. Rorschach said to Howard Stark seriously. Hey kid, do you think this is the time to be a hero? This isn't a movie, people are really going to die. Howard Stark yelled at Rorschach in a low voice. But Rorschach did not continue to say anything to Howard Stark. He reached out and picked up a broken wine bottle from the ground. Suddenly, he shook his hand and shot at an assassin in front of him. Aha, laugh. A cold light flashed past, and the next moment a blood flower splashed out. But the glass shard in Rorschach's hand shot directly through the wrist of an assassin like a hidden weapon. Bang! Naturally, the gun in the opponent's hand could no longer be held, and it just fell to the ground. Aha, aha, laugh, laugh. Rorschach kept moving and shot out 2 more glass shards. Along with 2 muffled sounds, the other 2 assassins were also hit on the wrists and lost their weapons. Are you kidding me? Howard Stark was dumbfounded and looked at Rorschach as if he were a monster. Even their top SHIELD agents don't have such skills. No, not even the Howling Commandos who killed Hydra in the first place couldn't reach it. After all, the glass shards are too light, and being able to throw them with such power is simply not something that ordinary people can do. Stay here honestly. Rorschach made another confession to Howard Stark. You guys, retreat to Howard. Rorschach shouted to the few remaining SHIELD agents again. Although those people didn't know Rorschach at all, they were able to distinguish the situation and immediately retreated to Howard Stark's side, entering a defensive state. It's a pity that the only exit channel has been blocked by the assassins, and everyone cannot evacuate with Howard first. We can only guard Howard for the time being, waiting for the mysterious young man to take care of the 3 assassins. Under the gazes of everyone, Rorschach strode towards the 3 assassins. Since these people are so strong that they can't be killed even by bullets, Rorschach really wants to try to see if they can continue to be alive and kicking if their hearts are blown up. I knew this operation wouldn't go so smoothly. A black bald assassin pulled the glass shards off his wrist as if nothing had happened. He didn't even blink. It was as if the glass shards weren't his own hand at all. Lem, this guy is not an ordinary person, what on earth is he? A long-haired assassin on the other side asked casually while looking at the 3rd assassin in a shirt. I don't know what he is, but they are obviously not those disgusting zombies. The assassin in the shirt stared at Rorschach and answered his companion's question. Zombie, what is this? Rorschach was a little curious about the name, but he didn't say much. He began to speed up and rushed towards the assassin closest to him. Just in time, let me tear this guy to pieces. The bald black assassin showed a very cruel smile on his face. Now is not the time, don't transform, Lime said to the other party in a deep voice. Transforming in public will make things very troublesome. Haha, there is no need to transform at all. The black bald assassin said this, and he also rushed towards Rorschach, and the 2 sides collided in the blink of an eye. Bang, crack, whoosh, but then, the sound of broken bones sounded, and the black bald man flew back like a cannonball. He also hit the wall hard. When he fell to the ground again, he was motionless. And his chest was sunken. Rorschach's punch almost turned the opponent's chest into mud. Andrew, Andrew. 2 shocked and angry shouts rang out, and the remaining Lime and the other 2 could not believe their eyes. Andrew was beaten to death with 1 punch. How is this possible? Even if Andrew did not transform, his physical qualities were far superior to those of ordinary people. What happened to this young guy? But now, there was no time for Lime and the other two to explore this. The pressure from Rorschach forced them to make a last resort. Crack, crack. The bones of Lime and the other assassin began to surge rapidly, and their bodies grew faster and longer hair grew out quickly. The original two people had disappeared, and in their place, two wolves stood upright in front of everyone. Werewolf. Rorschach was slightly startled. It must be said that he did not expect that there were werewolves in this world. But since werewolves exist, it means that vampires also exist. Rorschach suddenly understood what Lime had said before about the living dead. It's obviously a vampire. Shit, it's a werewolf. How could there be a werewolf? The faces of the few remaining S.H.I.E.L.D. agents suddenly became extremely ugly. Howard Stark also frowned like an old chrysanthemum blooming in late autumn. The existence of werewolves is naturally unknown to ordinary people, but it is not a secret in front of S.H.I.E.L.D. After all, S.H.I.E.L.D. eats this bowl of rice. It is precisely because of this that Howard Stark knows how dangerous the situation they are facing. Werewolves are something that can't be killed with conventional weapons. Especially after the transformation, it has become a real monster. It is extremely powerful, fierce and cruel, and it also has human reason. Unless it uses some powerful weapons such as grenades, even the most powerful agents will kneel when they see it. Danger, come back quickly. Howard Stark was afraid that Rorschach didn't know the severity of the situation, so he shouted at Rorschach. What are you guys still doing? Go and help. Then Howard ordered the agents around him. Roar, roar. A roar suddenly sounded, attracting the attention of Howard and his men. A werewolf roared and pounced on Rorschach in front of him. His mouth was wide open, and the sharp fangs in his mouth looked so shocking, and his two front paws were like sharp blades that made people feel cold all over. Be careful, Howard Stark couldn't help but exclaimed. Werewolf, I wonder if he can block my punch now. Rorschach not only didn't dodge, but also showed an eager look. He shook his shoulders and punched the werewolf directly. Howard almost jumped. This young man doesn't want to live. Crack, but in the next moment, the familiar sound of bone breaking sounded again, and the huge werewolf fell out again. Then his chest turned into a pool of mud and he lay motionless on the ground. Obviously, he followed in the footsteps of his old buddies. The whole bar suddenly became quiet. Whether it was Anton Vanko or Howard Stark and other S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, they were all dumbfounded. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was okay for the werewolves who hadn't transformed before, but this werewolf was a werewolf that had already transformed. Isn't this equivalent to killing a wolf with one punch? Even Captain America doesn't have this power, right? Howard Stark was completely stunned. How is this possible? Lime's heart was even more turbulent, and he couldn't believe his eyes no matter what he said. It was precisely because he was a werewolf that he knew more clearly what kind of power a werewolf had. He knew more clearly what it meant to kill a werewolf with one punch. Monster. People who saw them often called them monsters, but compared to them, the young man was the real monster. Go. After coming to his senses, Lime immediately made this decision. He didn't care about Howard Stark at all, and decisively turned around and started to flee quickly. But would Rorschach let Lime go? It would be fine if he didn't make a move, but once he did, he would not let anyone go. He suddenly exerted force and stomped hard on the ground. Crack. The ground was stepped into a pit because of the huge force, and the crack spread like a spider web. Under the huge reaction force, Rorschach's body was ejected directly like a cannonball. Instead, he appeared in front of Lime first. Just like that, he blocked Lime's way. Lime saw that there was no way to retreat, so he could only fight with Rorschach. He opened his mouth wide and rushed towards Rorschach with a roar. But Rorschach just stretched out his hand lightly and grabbed Lime's neck in an instant. Lime's huge body seemed to have been paused, unable to move forward any further. His claws waved wildly, struggling, grabbing onto Rorschach's body. But it was like grabbing on steel, and it didn't have any effect on Rorschach at all. At most, it just scratched some red marks on Rorschach's skin and scratched a little skin. Rorschach was still very satisfied with his physical strength at the moment. Although they are both claws, the claws of werewolves are far inferior to the claws of saber-toothed tigers. The claws of saber-toothed tigers can easily scratch the shell of a car. Rorschach still had the leisure to think about these things at this time, which shows that werewolves can't really bring Rorschach a little pressure. Let's end it here. Bang. Then Rorschach stretched out his other hand and punched Lime in the chest. Crack. Lime, who was still struggling in Rorschach's hands, drooped his head all of a sudden, and his body limp and motionless. Rorschach casually threw his hand and threw the other party to the ground, like throwing away a piece of garbage. Mission completed. Congratulations to the host for obtaining 50 origin points. At the same time, Luo Sha's mind flashed with the system's prompt sound. 50 origin points have been credited. Although it's just a drop in the bucket, it's still meat, Luo Sha said he didn't mind. But then Luo Sha checked and found that 50 origin points can only be used to strengthen a single attribute, and can't add to the overall unlocking progress. Of course, this is understandable, because with such a small amount of origin points, even 1% of the progress can't be unlocked. Luo Sha simply didn't move these origin points, but kept them for the time being. Save them for use later when there are more origin points than the basic unlocking. Young man, thank you very much for saving us. If it weren't for you today, things would be really bad. Howard Stark's voice interrupted Rorschach's thoughts. The playboy came to Rorschach quickly and expressed his gratitude to him sincerely. If it weren't for this magical young man, the consequences would be really disastrous. But what Howard Stark didn't know was that even if Rorschach didn't appear, he and Anton Vanko wouldn't die. But injuries should be inevitable. At the same time, the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents around him probably wouldn't survive. Mr. Stark, are you okay? Rorschach glanced at Howard Stark, who was dusty and embarrassed, and asked. I'm fine. I feel like I can have a few more drinks now. Howard Stark waved his hand, then stared at Rorschach and asked, Young man, what's your name? I'm Howard Stark, but you already know me, so I don't need to introduce myself, right? Rorschach. Rorschach reported his name. There was nothing to hide. Even if Howard Stark didn't ask specifically, Rorschach would find a chance to reveal his name. For him, if you do good things, you should leave your name. Rorschach. Howard Stark was a little surprised, so you are Chinese. In Howard Stark's impression, Chinese people are all people with very weak constitutions. He didn't expect that the one in front of him completely broke his impression of Chinese people. Bang! The door was suddenly pushed open at this time, but it was a vigorous woman who rushed in quickly with a group of people. This is a woman with a strong British style like Charles, and her figure is also very hot. Although she was not young at that time, she showed a more mature charm. Peggy Carter. When Rorschach saw the obvious difference between Peggy Carter and ordinary people, he seemed to understand what Captain America liked about this woman. Jesus Christ. Peggy Carter glanced at the mess on the scene and the 3 werewolf bodies lying on the ground, and her face changed immediately. Did the Soviet Union actually send werewolves to assassinate? What a negligence. They had only checked some well-trained agents or spies before, which allowed a few werewolves to successfully sneak in. Stark, are you okay? Peggy Carter's face immediately showed a trace of worry, and she quickly came to Howard Stark's side. Calm down, Peggy, I'm fine now. Howard Stark said to Peggy Carter in a tone of pretending to be relaxed, and even turned a circle in front of Peggy Carter. To show that he was fine. Peggy Carter was completely relieved. Then she looked at Anton Vanko, who was being watched by the S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, and confirmed that the mission had been completed, and then she set her sights on Rorschach. Stark, who is this? Peggy Carter glanced at Howard Stark. This is a magical Chinese boy. Fortunately, he showed up in time, otherwise we would have become food for those beasts. Howard Stark simply told Peggy Carter about the matter. After listening to it, Peggy Carter's eyes flashed with surprise, and she couldn't help but look at Rorschach twice more. His eyes flickered, and I don't know what he was thinking. Rorschach, thank you very much for everything you did today. It's very cool. Really, I've never seen such a cool young man. But next, can you take some time to go back with us? We need to know something from you. Don't get me wrong, this is all standard procedure. Oh, by the way, you may know that I am Howard Stark, but you probably don't know my other identity yet. Howard Stark then said politely to Rorschach, and at the same time took out a business card and handed it to Rorschach. National Strategic Defense Attack and Logistics Support Agency. Rorschach couldn't help shaking his head. Such a difficult name, I really don't know which great god came up with it. I know. Howard Stark looked helpless. In fact, I don't like this name either, but at least it can accurately indicate what we do, right? Mr. Stark, can I make a suggestion? Rorschach put away the business card. Of course. How about shield? Shield. Howard Stark's eyes lit up immediately. It's like a shield, protecting our homeland security. It's very vivid and very appropriate. Carter, to be honest, I think we might consider it. Peggy Carter's face on the side couldn't help but darken. Howard Stark, you are now the head of an intelligence organization, can you be a little more serious? Simon, you three stay, the rest of you, pack up. Peggy Carter gave orders in a swift and decisive manner. Rorschach, I promise, I won't delay you for too long, it's just a simple procedure. Howard added to Rorschach, how about it? Rorschach himself naturally had no great interest in going to S.H.I.E.L.D. to go through the procedures. But just when he was about to refuse, Rorschach changed his mind. S.H.I.E.L.D. was originally a place of controversy, and Howard Stark himself was also a person of great status. Will there be some more tasks triggered next? Although Rorschach had just completed a task, he felt that the possibility of triggering another task was not very high, but the system was not developed by Rorschach after all, and everything was just Rorschach's guess. Until now, Rorschach has not figured out what the mechanism of the system triggering tasks is. So why not take this opportunity to try it out? If the task can be triggered, it would be the best, and you can get another wave of origin point rewards. If the task cannot be triggered, it doesn't matter, at least you can expand your network like Howard Stark, and maybe you can use it in the future. It's 100 benefits for yourself. This account is worth it no matter how you calculate it. Rorschach made a decision. Okay, no problem, but before that, I need to say hello to my friends. Rorschach said to Howard Stark. Howard Stark saw Rorschach coming in with a middle-aged uncle. Therefore, Howard Stark knew what kind of person the friend Rorschach was talking about and where he was. Therefore, Howard Stark did not ask any further questions and immediately agreed. Of course, there is no problem. Agent Carter watched all this with cold eyes and did not stop it. But he calmly glanced at the several S.H.I.E.L.D. agents around him. After Rorschach walked into the back hall of the bar, the agents immediately pushed open the door and went to the back door of the bar to squat. Just in case Rorschach sneaks away. Of course, Rorschach was completely unaware of Agent Carter's little moves. He was not an agent, and he did not have the ability of an agent to observe words and emotions. But even if he knew, Rorschach wouldn't take it to heart. That is to say, he doesn't plan to leave. Otherwise, what's the use of Agent Carter sending more people to keep an eye on him? As Agent Carter's men began to take action, Rorschach walked into a passage. The passage is very long and narrow, and there is a small door at the end, which is very hidden. Rorschach was left speechless. When Caliban organized this battle, people who didn't know it thought he was some super wanted criminal. Why should he be so cautious? This is not ordinary sensitivity. Squeak. When he opened the door, something cold was pressed against his head. It was the big man who went out to call Ruiwen in before. He held the guy against Rorschach's head and shouted in a deep voice, "Be honest, if you dare to play tricks, I will make a hole in your head." Luo Sha smiled softly and said nothing. He suddenly reached out and grasped the barrel of the gun that was pressed against his head. "Use your hand." Click, click, click. The sound of metal being squeezed and deformed was heard, and then Rorschach let go of his hand, only to see that the barrel of the gun was flattened, with several fingerprints dented on it. Hiss. The big man suddenly gasped, as if he had seen a ghost. Luo Sha ignored the big man and walked forward swaggeringly, arriving at a hall in front. Rorschach. Raven's voice sounded, but he saw Ruiwen sitting inside, but a long sword was being pressed against her neck. The long sword was held in the hands of a woman with long hair and a sharp aura. Psylocke. There was a seat next to Psylocke, and Caliban was sitting there with a stern expression. How is this going? Rorschach felt a little confused. Didn't he just come in and ask Caliban for a favor, or for a fee? How did it get to such a tense level? Caliban was about to ask you the same question. Caliban just stood up, opened the drawer, took out a gun from inside, pointed it at Rorschach. What is going on? Caliban, you misunderstood. We don't know what's going on, I swear. With a sharp blade holding her neck, Raven didn't dare to move rashly and shouted nervously to Caliban. Then why did a gunfight break out here as soon as you arrived? You wouldn't tell Caliban that this was just a coincidence, would you? Caliban didn't believe Raven at all. Caliban, let go of Raven. If we really want to do something to you, why are you so good now? Rorschach's balls ached slightly. This is really a coincidence. So, why didn't you just tell Caliban your purpose? Why did you bring those agents here to Caliban? Caliban continues to question Rorschach at gunpoint. Rorschach, well, things are not explained clearly. If that's the case, then let's not explain it at all. Rorschach just focused his gaze on the firearm in Caliban's hand, and with a thought, 2 heat rays shot directly over. Laugh. The firearm in Caliban's hand was directly destroyed by the heat ray. The face of Psylocke on the side suddenly changed. One hand held Mystique unchanged with a long sword, and the other hand suddenly condensed a purple sharp blade and struck Rorschach fiercely. Aha! But the next moment, Lingdi felt that his eyes were blurred. The original Rorschach had disappeared and appeared in another place. Laugh. 2 more heat rays were shot out, and the long sword in Lingdi's hand flew away. Psylocke was startled. How could she not understand that the young Oriental young man in front of her was very powerful and could not be dealt with by her distraction? So he immediately gave up on Ruiwen, who had no fighting ability. The purple blade in his hand suddenly turned into a purple energy whip, and it was whipped towards Rorschach with a snap. But like a dexterous cat, Rorschach easily escaped Psylocke's fatal whip by scurrying around. Snapped. Spirit Butterfly's whip suddenly hit the ground, leaving a mark on the ground. She then shook her shoulders, turned around and twitched again. Bang bang bang. After 3 consecutive whips, Psylocke's whip failed, but Luo Sha successfully deceived her into being in front of her. Not good. Lingdi was shocked. The boy in front of him was as slippery as a loach, and he couldn't stop her such a stormy attack. She wanted to attack again, but a hand suddenly came out and grabbed Psylocke's neck. Psylocke didn't dare to move, because her life was in the hands of the other party. As long as the other party wanted, he could break her neck at any time. Raven, have you got the answer we want? Rorschach had the opportunity to ask Raven this question at this time. Raven nodded on the side. In fact, things were very smooth at the beginning. Caliban loved money. After getting the money, he helped Raven to sense it very readily. As a result, when Raven was about to leave, there was a sudden gunshot outside. Caliban, who was more sensitive and suspicious, immediately ordered people to arrest Raven. Rorschach, let's go. Raven didn't intend to pursue this matter any further and walked to Rorschach's side. Rorschach did the same. This matter was actually a misunderstanding at the beginning, and he didn't really do anything to Psylocke and Caliban because of it. So Rorschach directly let go of the hand that was pinching Psylocke's neck and left with Raven. Raven, did Caliban sense Xiao? Rorschach asked Raven this question first. Raven shook her head with a hint of excitement on her face. No, Xiao is not within Caliban's sensing range. Caliban is not far from Xavier Manor, so Xiao is indeed safe within a radius of 25 miles from Caliban. It is basically certain that Xiao did not find Xavier Manor, which is a good thing. Rorschach, what's going on outside? Why was there such a fierce gun battle? After answering Luo Sha's question, Raven couldn't wait to ask about this thing that she had never quite understood. Raven, this is exactly what I want to say to you. Rorschach stopped at this time, and when Raven saw this, she also stopped in front of Rorschach. The two of them stood at the small door and did not go out immediately. I may have accidentally gotten into trouble. Luo Sha spread her hands towards Raven. Raven suddenly became slightly nervous. What's the trouble? Luo Sha, are you okay? I'm fine, don't worry. Maybe I used the wrong word, but it's not really a problem. To put it simply, when you came in to find Caliban, there happened to be a group of agents outside performing a certain task. Rui Wen couldn't help but feel speechless. It turned out that this was the origin of the burst of gunfire. What happened is purely a coincidence, nothing more. But what does this have to do with you? But Ruiwen also knew that things might not be that simple, so she asked again. What's even more coincidental is that Howard Stark was also involved in the gunfight. Howard Stark? Is that Howard Stark? Raven was very surprised. That kind of big man would come to such a small place. Yes, that's Howard Stark. After I recognized him, I rescued him. In the end, I didn't expect that Howard Stark was actually the leader of those agents. Having said this, Rorschach casually took out the business card that Howard Stark gave to him and handed it to Raven. Rui Wen felt that her brain was not enough. That rich man who was famous throughout the country suddenly transformed into an executive of an intelligence organization with a long and stinky name but no idea of its power. So, I need to make a transcript or a confession or something like that. Luo Sha took back the business card handed to Raven. Rui Wen naturally understood these processes and didn't say much. Okay, then you go back first. I will go back after I'm done here. Rorschach greeted Raven, and the two parties separated. Raven went back to Xavier Manor first, while Rorschach followed Howard Stark and others to the SHIELD base. The current SHIELD, no, it should be said to be the Homeland Strategic Defense Attack and Logistics Support Agency, actually does not have its own dedicated base. The camp used was still the camp of the 78th Artillery Regiment of the Navy Battalion in the Army. Although this place is not very famous, it is of great significance throughout Marvel. Because this is the birthplace of Captain America. It is also the first base of SHIELD, the world's largest intelligence agency in the future. Howard's special car slowly drove into the base compound. Rorschach looked out through the car window and felt that everything seemed similar. It's vaguely the same as the scene in Avengers 4 Inches where Captain America traveled back to get the Rubik's Cube. I'm curious about this place. Do you also want to ask me if this is the place where Rogers was born? Howard, who was sitting next to him, saw Rorschach looking at him non-stop, so he couldn't help but joked, if you are also a fan of Captain America, then my answer may disappoint you. This is not the birthplace of Rogers. Just think about it, how could someone be born in a place like this? The fact is, this is the birthplace of the title, Captain America. At that time, we were discussing what kind of nickname we should give Rogers, Captain Super, Fantastic Soldier, Mr. Super. In the end Rogers chose to use Captain America. But I didn't expect that the rumor would spread and it would become that Rogers was born here. Rorschach did not expect that there was such a story behind the nickname Captain America. By this time the motorcade had stopped and everyone got out of the car. Luo Sha took a look and found that Anton Venki did not come with him. He couldn't help but ask curiously, that friend of yours didn't come with us? First of all, he is not my friend, and secondly, this is not a place where anyone can come. Howard Stark patted Rorschach on the shoulder. Anton Vanko is not cooperating with SHIELD on the surface, Howard Stark has other arrangements for him. Okay, let's go. Howard Stark greeted Rorschach and started walking towards the office building. Boom, but only halfway there, an explosion suddenly came. A powerful shock wave rippled out, causing the ground beneath everyone's feet to tremble. It stands to reason that such a violent explosion would definitely blow up the scene, but to Rorschach's great surprise, everyone in the camp looked at the direction of the explosion and shook their heads helplessly. That's all. Some people even had no change in their expressions from beginning to end, without blinking their eyes. As calm as an old dog. Bang! In the direction of the earthquake source, an iron door opened. A very short guy wearing glasses rushed out quickly. He also covered his mouth and nose and coughed loudly. He was so disgraced and embarrassed. It's him. Rorschach only glanced at the short guy and immediately showed a hint of surprise. At the same time, he also understood what the explosion just now was. Arnim-Zola. The man who rushed out was Arnim-Zola, the former top scientist under the Red Skull. After the fall of the Red Skull, Arnim-Zola was captured by the Strategic Science Corps, the predecessor of SHIELD, and was successfully turned against by Agent Carter. He was whitewashed and became an important scientist in SHIELD. Of course, all this was a disguise. No one knew that Arnim-Zola was a fanatic of Hydra from beginning to end, and even after his death, he was still working for Hydra. But regardless of his position, Arnim-Zola was also a scientist at the top of the pyramid. Otherwise, why did Hydra still go to great lengths to preserve his brain after his death? Without mentioning anything else, just looking at the weapons developed based on the Cosmic Cube, in the current era, it is already very, very remarkable. And it is obvious, the explosion just now must have been caused by Arnim-Zola's scientific research. And it is definitely not the first time that such a thing has happened, so everyone in the base is so calm. Arnim, is everything okay? Howard saw the dusty Arnim Zola and shouted at him. It's okay, just a small accident, everything is under control. Arnim Zola waved to Howard. Then he plunged into the iron gate with thick smoke. Fanatical scientist, right? Howard didn't take this matter to heart at all. He turned around and patted Rorschach on the shoulder, signaling to continue on the road. Mr. Stark, are you as crazy as him? Rorschach took a step and walked forward with Howard. No, I am an exception. I am a rare genius in the world. There is no need to be so crazy. Howard Stark was arrogant and was no less arrogant than Tony Stark. The two chatted from time to time and walked into the lobby of the office building. A young man who looked a little elegant came to greet them. Mr. Stark, you are back. The voice was so familiar that Rorschach recognized the voice before recognizing the face. Jarvis, take Mr. Rorschach to room 218 first. Howard Stark said to Jarvis. Rorschach, wait for me for a moment. Please excuse me. Then Howard Stark greeted Rorschach again and stood up and left. Mr. Rorschach, I am Mr. Stark's butler Jarvis. Please follow me, Jarvis said to Rorschach very politely. Thank you, you're welcome. After taking Rorschach to a place similar to a conference room, Jarvis politely left. Rorschach fell into deep thought. The unexpected encounter with Arnim Zola just now reminded Rorschach of another thing. The place where Arnim Zola came out seemed to be the place where Iron Man stole the Cosmic Cube in Avengers 4. In other words, the Cosmic Cube is now lying in a place less than a few hundred meters away from Rorschach. Are you moved? Of course I am a little bit. As a time traveler, Rorschach knows how powerful the Cosmic Cube is, so he will not be indifferent. The power contained in the Cosmic Cube is enough to change the world. Of course, Rorschach is not the kind of ambitious person who wants to rule the world and the earth through the Cosmic Cube. It's just that Rorschach has a very crazy and bold plan in his mind recently. The Cosmic Cube may play a huge role in that plan. Of course, for now, Rorschach is just a budding mutant, and his level is far from reaching it. No matter what kind of plan it is, it can only be temporarily shelved. With such random thoughts in his mind, Howard Stark, who went back to change his clothes, came to Rorschach. With him, there was Peggy Carter. To be honest, Rorschach was very surprised by this. You know, Peggy Carter is also the founder of S.H.I.E.L.D., a routine inquiry, is it necessary to alarm the two founders? Are the founders of S.H.I.E.L.D. too idle to do anything? Rorschach, you have already met Agent Carter, so I won't introduce you any further. Howard Stark sat down opposite Rorschach with a very gentle attitude, and this is just a routine questioning, don't be nervous, okay? Mr. Stark, please ask. Rorschach, why did you appear in that tavern? My friend is a frequent visitor to this tavern, and my friend brought me here. Before you went there, did you know that I was also in this tavern? I don't know. Howard Stark was right, this was just a routine questioning, and there was no trick in it, so it went very smoothly. There was nothing worth mentioning. It ended very quickly. Rorschach, can I ask how you can kill a werewolf with one punch? According to the information we have, it takes at least 5 tons of force to punch. It is impossible for an ordinary person to have such a strong force, unless you have undergone enhanced transformation like Rogers. Peggy Carter, who had not spoken all this time, spoke with a serious face at this time, and asked a series of deadly questions right away. Where did you undergo the transformation? Tell me. Agent Carter, I think you misunderstood. I am not a transformed person. I have never undergone any enhanced transformation. Rorschach was speechless. No transformation. Are you telling me that your strong power is innate and you are gifted? Peggy Carter couldn't help but sneered. Only ghosts would believe this set of rhetoric. Yes, that's it. Rorschach spread his hands. Rorschach, I hope you know that we are not those organizations like the police and the CIA. We are not so easy to fool. Peggy Carter's tone was a little stern. So Mr. Stark, am I a prisoner now? Rorschach glanced at Howard Stark. Rorschach was gradually annoyed by Peggy Carter's trick. Of course not. Howard Stark hurriedly clarified. Rorschach, don't get me wrong, Agent Carter is just like that. Howard Stark actually understood why Carter was like this. Captain America secretly left a few tubes of his own serum just in case, and even left one tube for Howard Stark. Of course, Howard Stark gave that tube of serum to Peggy Carter in the end, and Peggy Carter poured it into the water and destroyed it. But some serum still leaked out. So Peggy Carter naturally thought that Rorschach was copied by some secret organization through studying Captain America's serum. She naturally wouldn't have a very good attitude. Since it's not, then Mr. Stark, I have something else to do, can I leave? Rorschach stood up directly. You haven't made it clear yet. Peggy Carter also stood up. Rorschach simply ignored it and just looked at Howard Stark. Peggy, can you talk to me for a minute? Howard Stark hurriedly pulled Peggy Carter aside and persuaded her in a low voice. Rorschach did not do anything illegal from beginning to end, and even saved him. Don't say that this is just a guess based on wind and shadow. Even if someone really used Roger's serum, what? There is nothing to blame. Peggy Carter is also a rational and mature adult who can control her emotions well. Under Howard Stark's persuasion, Peggy Carter did not continue to pester her. After she glanced at Rorschach, she turned around and left. But Rorschach knew that Peggy Carter would definitely not give up. This old woman would definitely continue to investigate in secret. But Rorschach didn't take this matter to heart. Anyway, the mutants would soon be exposed, and he was not afraid of the investigation at all. Okay, Rorschach, thank you for your time. Howard Stark walked up to Rorschach and shook hands with him. I will let Jarvis take you back. In addition, when you have time, come to my house for a simple meal. I really want to express my gratitude in private. Of course, no problem. Rorschach readily agreed. Going to Howard Stark's house as a guest sounds very good. In addition, werewolves are usually organized and large-scale. Today you killed 3 werewolves, but this is definitely not the business of 3 werewolves. If there is any trouble, you know my phone number. Howard Stark said to Rorschach seriously again. I will. Rorschach waved his hand. Mr. Rorschach, goodbye. Jarvis, goodbye. At an intersection on 75th Street in New York, Rorschach waved to Jarvis, who was bidding him a polite farewell. He subconsciously looked at a car not far behind him, and a disdainful sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth. That car has already followed him all the way. Rorschach knew that it was the person sent by Peggy Carter. He didn't expect that Peggy Carter would react so greatly to his superhuman strength. True, Rorschach was not an agent and did not have any counter-reconnaissance skills, but he found this out very easily when he knew that Peggy Carter would not give up. Just use your super hearing to listen and you will immediately understand. In fact, if Peggy Carter is willing to ask herself nicely, Rorschach may not hide it. After all, mutants are nothing shameful. Rorschach has never done anything harmful, so what should he not say to others? But the old woman had such an attitude that Luo Sha didn't bother to pay attention to her. And Rorschach would naturally not let Peggy Carter succeed in quietly following him, which is why he asked Jarvis to park his car here on 75th Street. Agent Carter, I am not a soft persimmon who can be manipulated by others. Rorschach whispered to himself, and then without any hesitation, he walked directly towards the black car that was following him. Dang dang dang. Rorschach knocked on the car window directly. Soon the window was rolled down, revealing a middle-aged man eating a hot dog. Kid, what do you want to do? Get out of my way. The middle-aged man deliberately pretended not to recognize Rorschach and scolded Rorschach with his eyes wide open. Rorschach didn't say anything, and just grabbed the middle-aged man with one hand. With a gentle tug, he pulled the other person out of the car. Holding the opponent's collar, he lifted the opponent in the air. As big as a middle-aged man, in Rorschach's hands, he was as defenseless as a baby. Go back and tell Peggy Carter not to bother me. My temper is not that good every time. Rorschach smiled sarcastically at the middle-aged man, and then threw it upward. Whoosh! The middle-aged man flew up and landed heavily on the roof of the house next to him. He was so shaken that all the bones in his body almost fell apart. After doing all this, Rorschach acted as if nothing had happened. He walked forward as if nothing had happened and merged into the crowd. Disappear. Only the middle-aged man was left shivering on the roof, wanting to cry without tears. Chief Carter allowed himself to be followed by what kind of monster was this? After shaking off the tail behind him, nothing happened on the way. Rorschach returned to Xavier Manor very smoothly. But I saw everyone talking and laughing in the hall, and the atmosphere was great. Where was the dull and depressed look from before? As soon as Rorschach appeared, everyone at the scene came to greet Rorschach enthusiastically. After the Black Emperor incident, Rorschach has completely established his prestige in the hearts of mutants. Rorschach, man, I really have you. The siren's eyes were shining with admiration on his face. You actually saved Howard Stark. Isn't this crazy? It seems that after Ruiwen came back, she had already finished showing off this matter to everyone. Yes, this is definitely the craziest thing I have ever heard, and it is also the coolest thing. The Ravager was also very excited. Man, how are you and Howard? Are you easy to get along with? Darwin, who has always been mature and steady, was no longer calm. There is no way. Howard Stark is really a super important figure to everyone present. It was like everyone was attending a class reunion and suddenly heard that their brothers in the dormitory had rescued Jack Ma. The shock, excitement are not difficult to imagine. Mr. Stark is a very nice person. Apart from the fact that he is not as handsome as me, there is nothing wrong with him. Luo Sha smiled coquettishly and patted the empty space on the sofa. The atmosphere in the hall is relaxed and cheerful. Without the Black Emperor to worry about, the mutants naturally stayed in Xavier Manor and waited for the arrival of Charles and the others. Enjoying the life of a superior person that you have never experienced before. Even everyone was a little happy and wished that Charles and the others would come back later. The Bronx, a very dilapidated abandoned building. In the extremely dirty compound, filled with garbage and sewage, there was a domineering and luxurious Cadillac parked. It was somewhat incompatible with the on-site environment. In front of Cadillac, there were 4 people standing. They are Stryker, Wade, who is not Deadpool yet, and 2 other ordinary agents. Of course, this is only superficial power. In other corners that outsiders cannot detect, there are actually some snipers arranged by Stryker. Looking at Stryker's formation, he seemed to be waiting for someone. Sir, you know that I have some slight mysophobia, so the smell of this place really makes me feel a little uncomfortable. Wade started chattering again. Shut up, Wade, Stryker yelled at Wade in a low voice. Wade then shut up in a sullen manner. But Stryker knew that it was useless, because Wade would start again in 10 seconds. Fortunately, another car slowly drove over at this time. A man in a black windbreaker and long hair walked in front of Stryker. The person they were waiting for finally came. I said, try to reduce unnecessary meetings, I want to keep a low profile. The long-haired man said to Stryker with some dissatisfaction. Only the weak will blindly pursue a low profile, while the strong will solve the problem, Lucian. Stryker said in a meaningful tone. Lucian was not here to listen to Stryker's preaching. He asked directly, tell me, what's the matter? Considering that our previous cooperation was very pleasant, I think I need to continue to hire some people from you. Stryker did not beat around the bush. No, our cooperation has ended long ago. I helped you catch the person you wanted to catch. I did what I promised, but what about you? You never found the person I asked you to find. What's more, you already have mutants now, and you don't need my people anymore. No, Lucian, I need them very much. Logan is gone, Zero and Sabretooth are dead, and my mutant team has fallen apart. In fact, now I don't even have anyone available except Wade. This is not my problem, Stryker, you know my situation, I can't expose it. 3 days ago, 3 of my tribesmen were beaten to death by an Oriental, and I chose to forget about it, so I'm sorry. Lucian said it unintentionally, but Stryker opposite him couldn't help but feel moved. Beating a werewolf to death is not something that ordinary people can do. Maybe it's a mutant, and that person is an Oriental. At the beginning, Stryker asked the portrait artist to draw a portrait of the murderer who killed Sabretooth, and it seems that he was also an Oriental. Although it was dark at the time and the witnesses could not see clearly, which seriously affected the accuracy of the portrait. But there is no doubt whether it is a Westerner or an Oriental. Just as Stryker and Lucian were plotting, a plane flew back to New York from the Soviet Union. Then a car started to speed over, and at the fastest speed, it appeared at the CIA secret base that was almost in ruins. Jesus Christ, what happened here? Charles looked at the broken walls and ruins on the ground, and the bloodstains that could be seen everywhere even though they had been cleaned up, and he was completely confused. Eric beside him also held his forehead with his hand, looking very confused. What happened? They just went to the Soviet Union for a few days, but when they turned back, the base was ruined. In fact, when they were operating in the Soviet Union, Mora had received news from the CIA headquarters that something had happened to the base here. It was invaded by Shao. As a result, this is called an accident. This is a disaster. Okay. Mutants, how are the mutants here? Charles immediately asked a CIA agent stationed here with a nervous look. We didn't find their bodies. The agent replied. This can be said to be both good news and bad news. The good news is that the absence of corpses proves that they are not dead. The bad news is that those mutants are likely to have been captured by Black Emperor Shao, and this is something Charles does not want to see. Charles, the situation may not be that bad. Rapids and Red Devil are dead. It was Rorschach who killed them. Eric pondered for a while, but spoke to Charles. That's right, Rorschach. Charles was also refreshed. If Rorschach was there, things would not be so bad, right? That's right. Eric and Charles naturally did not know the details of what happened at that time, but they had investigated Black Emperor for so long, so they naturally knew the abilities of Red Devil and Rapids. Not to mention, Charles and Eric had fought with Shao on the cruise ship. He had witnessed the power of Rapids with his own eyes. If there was anyone among the mutants who could kill these two, it would be Rorschach. According to the intelligence provided by the CIA, there were only 3 people who invaded the base: Black Emperor, Rapids and Red Devil. This gave Charles hope. Black Emperor wouldn't capture all the mutants by himself, right? After a brief exchange with Eric, the two agreed that the mutants had probably escaped. New York is so big, where will they escape to? Eric still felt a little headache. Those people came from all over the world, and the time they spent together was not very long, so it was difficult to make any effective speculation and analysis. If I were Raven, Eric, I might know where they are hiding. Charles gradually grasped something. Xavier Manor, her own home. That was the only place Raven could go. The two looked at each other, and there was no more nonsense. They quickly got into the car, leaving behind a trail of dust. More than 40 minutes later, the figures of Charles and Eric appeared at the door of Xavier Manor. Charles, are you sure they are inside? Eric's hand pushing the door stopped in midair, and he turned his head to look at Charles beside him. Yes, they are inside. Charles smiled. He had already used his ability to sense that everyone was there. Everyone is here, not one less. Huh. Eric let out a long sigh of relief, and his tense face suddenly relaxed. Charles, you never told me that you actually lived in such an outrageous place. Eric teased Charles, and without hesitation, he pushed the door open. Well, you never asked about this either. Charles replied casually, and walked into the hall quickly with Eric. Familiar faces such as Mystique Raven, Hank the Beast, Darwin, Angel, Siren, etc. all turned their heads. They came into the eyes of Charles and Eric. Of course, Rorschach, who they trusted the most, was also indispensable. Charles, Eric, you are back. The atmosphere in the hall exploded after a slight pause, and all the young people came to greet them with surprise and joy. Charles and Eric are finally here. The hearts that everyone had been worried about for the past few days finally settled down and became more at ease. I feel relieved to see that you are all safe and sound. Charles looked at the young faces and showed a look of relief. Although Eric on the side was a little serious, the muscles on his face were also very relaxed. You all did a good job, very good. He also expressed his appreciation for the young people very rarely. No matter how these people did it, it was really not easy for everyone to escape successfully when the entire base was destroyed. We didn't do anything, it was all Rorschach. The Siren couldn't help but interrupted and said. Yes, it was Rorschach who led us out. The Ravager immediately added. They obviously did nothing, but they were praised by Eric so much, and the Ravager felt a little unworthy. No, you didn't get knocked down in that desperate situation, you didn't compromise, you came here with your own efforts, you all impressed me, I am proud of you. Charles glanced at everyone at the scene and said to everyone very seriously. Charles, everyone in the base, was killed. Mystique Raven raised her head, and her tone suddenly became much heavier. The atmosphere at the scene, which was originally very light, also became heavy. Okay, Eric nodded. Tell us what happened in the base. Mystique Raven, Beast Hank, Darwin and others told Charles and Eric what happened at that time in great detail. As bystanders, the two couldn't help but feel a sense of fear when they heard it. What happened at that time was really too thrilling. And Raven and the people involved, although the incident had passed for 3 or 4 days, when they recalled it again, their faces still couldn't help but pale. Luckily, Rorschach is here, otherwise I can't imagine what the result would be. The siren sighed sincerely. Yes, thanks to Rorschach. Hank echoed. Rorschach, you performed very well, even far beyond my expectations. Charles also gave Rorschach a look of approval. In the incident that night, Rorschach can be said to be the one who turned the tide, and his contribution cannot be erased in any way. Charles and Eric were very fortunate that Rorschach did not follow them to the Soviet Union at that time, but stayed in the base. Otherwise, the consequences would be disastrous. Chapter 31. Charles, what should we do next? Can we go back to the CIA? Hank raised his head at this time, looked at Charles and asked. Unlike other mutants, Hank was originally a researcher of the CIA, and his identity as a mutant was not even exposed when he worked in the CIA. Naturally, he has a different sense of belonging to the CIA than others. And the CIA can provide Hank with all scientific research resources, and Hank still likes his original job very much. Hank, I'm sorry, but it is very likely that you can't go back, and we can't go back either. After a moment of hesitation, Charles still told the truth. This secret base of mutants was actually very controversial in the CIA at the beginning, and many executives did not agree. Now that such a thing has happened again, it is almost impossible for the CIA to reallocate resources for reconstruction. I am afraid that Charles's cooperation with the CIA will end here. From now on, all their actions can only rely on themselves, and they have nothing to do with the CIA anymore. Is that so? What should we do in the future? Darwin, Siren, Angel, Destroyer and other young people were a little confused and at a loss. They waited for Charles and others for 3 days, just to wait for a result, but they didn't expect it to be such a result. Charles and Eric couldn't help but look at each other. Yes, the CIA ruthlessly abandoned them, so how would they settle the mutants they recruited in the future? Raven, can you entertain everyone for me? Charles thought about it and said to Mystique Raven. Raven knew that Charles must have something to discuss with Eric, so she didn't ask much. According to Charles, he presided over the situation on the scene as the host. Charles hooked his chin at Eric and led Eric to his room. I plan to send everyone home. After closing the door, Charles didn't say much nonsense and told Eric his plan directly. No, Charles, we have to keep them. Remember why we recruited them. Whether there is CIA or not, I will not stop. I stayed not because of CIA at first, but because of you, Charles. Eric raised objections. They are just a group of children. A group of children can't escape in that situation. Okay, Eric, except for Rorschach, but most of them. Charles, Xiao has a team, we also need a team. You know, we need it. Otherwise, no one can stop Xiao. Eric interrupted Charles decisively. Charles was silent. He knew that Eric was right. Only mutants can deal with mutants. The slaughter of the CIA base this time is a good example. Ordinary people are really like lambs to be slaughtered in front of mutants with various abilities. And Charles and Eric alone are far from enough. Okay, Eric, but we need to train them. After some contemplation, Charles made such a decision and said to Eric heavily. Eric couldn't help but show a hint of joy on his face. Everyone, including you. Charles glared at his old friend unhappily. Come on, Charles, are you serious? Eric asked back in a very exaggerated tone. He was not those kids. What do you think? Charles said this, ignored Eric, and strode out of the door. Eric shook his head helplessly and followed quickly. Okay, everyone. As soon as the two arrived in the hall, everyone's eyes looked over again, and Charles told everyone about his and Eric's decision. Although we will no longer have any relationship with the CIA, Eric and I still plan to form our own team. You have all seen what kind of person Xiao is. We will be the only team that can stop him. Eric and I, and you. Of course, you are not ready yet, far from it. The same is true for Eric and I, so if you are willing to stay, I will give him special training. Of course, if anyone wants to quit, I will arrange it immediately and send him home. Charles's words echoed in the hall. The mutants looked at each other and made a decision in their hearts. I don't want to go back to prison again, the Ravager immediately stated. I have nowhere to go. Beast Hank also shrugged. Charles, do you think I can go back and drive my taxi peacefully after going through so many things? Darwin spread his hands. I didn't have so many friends before, so, Siren also said that he didn't want to leave his friends. This is where I grew up, where can I go? Raven said as a matter of course, and then she glanced at Rorschach across from her. Rorschach, what about you? As Raven said this, everyone at the scene subconsciously turned their attention to Rorschach. There is no doubt that Rorschach is the most important person among all of them. Whether Rorschach will stay or go is undoubtedly the most touching. Rorschach, you are a very talented person. Eric even personally asked him to stay. If you leave, it will be a great loss for us. I really hope you stay. Eric, why make the atmosphere so heavy? When did I say I was leaving? Rorschach smiled. Eric was obviously relieved. Many people at the scene couldn't help but secretly breathe a sigh of relief. Sorry. When the atmosphere was good, Angel suddenly poured cold water on everyone. Charles, I don't know Xiao, but Xiao almost killed everyone in the base, but didn't do anything to us. But the people who ruthlessly mocked us are precisely those CIA people. I'm sorry, I can't do it. Angel, Raven and Angel are the only two women, and the relationship between the two is still very good. She immediately began to persuade Angel. Raven, I'm sorry, but I don't think I belong here. Angel stood up with a very firm attitude. Okay, Salvador. Charles nodded. He didn't say much about it. Everyone has their own choice. Thank you for your company during this time. I will take you home. Hey, girl. Eric's attitude was much more impolite. You know, if I see you on the battlefield, I won't hold back at all. Eric. Charles frowned slightly. What? Charles, do you still think of them as children who are psychologically fragile and can't bear the cruel truth? I think it's time to make a change, for us and for them. Eric was very confident, but it must be said that to some extent, it does make sense. The back door of Xavier Manor. Charles and Eric stood at the door, looking at a black car that was slowly leaving in front of them, with different expressions. Charles's expression was still quite complicated. In any case, this was the man he had recruited himself, and he had been with him for so long, but he didn't expect that he would have to send him away in person now. Eric had a cold face, and there was no change in his expression. Charles, you have erased her related memories, right? As the black car was getting farther and farther away, Eric just remembered something and asked Charles beside him seriously. My God, Eric, she is a child who has been with us for a few months, she is not an enemy. Charles said to Eric speechlessly. Charles never used his ability on his own people, let alone such a bad thing as erasing memory. No, she is not now. You also saw her attitude towards Xiao. Eric shook his head. So, just because of this, she will help Xiao to deal with us. Eric, you are too worried. I am just taking precautions. Eric, listen to what you said. If we do whatever we want because we are worried about something that has not happened and will never happen, what is the difference between us and Xiao? Charles, this is your problem. You always think things are too good. And you always think things are too bad. The air was slightly filled with the smell of gunpowder. Charles and Eric looked at each other. Both of them were a little helpless and headache. In fact, similar quarrels have happened more than once between the two, and every time, they could not convince each other. Rorschach, what do you think? Eric was too lazy to waste words with Charles. He knew it was useless, so he looked at Rorschach on the side and asked. Since knowing what Rorschach did at the CIA base, the attitudes of the two towards Rorschach changed again. Although Rorschach is still very young, they all regard Rorschach as a person of the same generation as themselves. Some decisions and so on, they also began to call Rorschach together, and the original duo became a trio. As for Charles and Eric's appreciation of Rorschach, no other mutants questioned it, and it was all what Rorschach deserved. Charles, I think Eric is right, you are too idealistic. Rorschach thought about it and said to Charles. Eric on the side couldn't help but smile. He really didn't misjudge Rorschach. But Eric, I think Charles is right, you are too negative. But Rorschach quickly added. Eric's shark-like smile froze directly. Ha ha ha. Charles couldn't help laughing out loud. Eric, you heard it, this is not what I said. So Rorschach, you don't agree with Charles, and you don't agree with me. If it were you, what would you do? Eric restrained his shark-like smile and asked Rorschach seriously. Neutralize the two of you, Charles. I will have the same beautiful ideals about the world as you, but at the same time, I will also make some necessary preparations to prevent the negative situation that Eric thinks will happen. In short, it is to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Rorschach thought about it and said what he thought. Charles and Eric both fell into deep thought. Rorschach can be said to have combined their thinking habits, but it is impossible for them to do so. After all, it is easier said than done to think in someone else's shoes. It is difficult to change a person's personality and thoughts. So, how are you going to deal with the angel? Eric's voice sounded again, with a posture of breaking the casserole to get to the bottom of it. I will erase the angel's memory. Sorry Charles, but my choice this time is the same as Eric's. Rorschach said without hesitation, there are many times when it is not what the angel will do. Those who want to get information from the angel do not need the angel to speak. Don't think that the information the angel knows is irrelevant information. In fact, it is quite the opposite. Angel not only knows the real location of the Mutant Academy in the future, but also knows the abilities of several elders. These can be used to make a big fuss. For example, Old Stryker has always heard rumors about the Mutant Academy, but he has never found this magical place. In the end, he got the information from Magneto. He immediately led people to attack the Mutant Academy. If it weren't for Wolverine's garrison, all the mutants in the school would have been captured by Stryker. Eric showed a look of relief again. Charles couldn't help but wonder if Eric had led Rorschach astray. Okay, it's time to go back. We still have a lot of sweat to shed next. Eric greeted Charles and Rorschach, and returned to Xavier Manor first. On the extremely spacious playground, Mystique Raven, Beast Hank, Darwin, Siren and other mutants have gathered and are waiting to start Charles's training. Okay, Charles clapped his hands. He glanced at the young people at the scene and found that everyone's spirit and energy were completely different from before. He still felt very satisfied. It seems that after the Black Emperor incident, everyone has grown up more or less. Let me see each of your current abilities. Don't be shy, come one by one. After understanding your situation, I will make a separate training plan for you. Who will come first? Charles glanced at the young faces in front of him and asked expectantly. Some of the young mutants were eager to try, while others looked embarrassed, but no one could escape anyway. In the end, one by one, they showed their current abilities in front of Charles and everyone. Charles couldn't help scratching his head. He knew that everyone had a poor control over their abilities, but he didn't expect it to be so poor. This comparison made Rorschach's uniqueness more prominent. Charles still couldn't imagine that the other party could control his abilities so perfectly. You know, even Eric can't do this now. Well, everyone's situation is really hard to describe. Charles carefully considered the language and tried to use a more euphemistic word. Just as he was about to say something else, Charles suddenly sensed something and clapped his hands. Okay, we'll stop here today and gather here at the same time tomorrow. The young mutants dispersed, but Eric and Rorschach stayed behind. Because Charles winked at them. Charles, what's wrong? Eric walked up to Charles and asked in a puzzled tone. Mora is here. Charles said to Eric and Rorschach that he had sensed Mora's arrival. Eric's face became serious. Since Mora is here, it means that the CIA has already achieved results. The few of them looked at each other and without any nonsense, they went to the door together and took Mora into Charles's room. As we expected, the CIA has disbanded our organization. From now on, you will no longer have anything to do with the CIA. After everyone sat down, Mora spoke to everyone with a solemn expression. This result was not beyond everyone's expectations. The CIA really gave up on everyone. Fine, Eric spread his hands, this can't change anything, and we don't need the CIA in the first place. How about you? Charles looked at Mora and asked. During his time working with Mora in the CIA, Charles had developed feelings for Maura that went beyond friendship. They said it was because of my proposal that the CIA suffered such losses, so now I'm suspended. Maura deliberately said in a relaxed tone, but she still couldn't hide some disappointment in her heart. It's the usual style of those people to find someone to take the blame when something goes wrong. Charles defended Maura. But despite this, there is nothing that everyone can do now. Let's not talk about this anymore. So, what about you? What are your plans next? Maura clapped her hands, changed the topic, looked at everyone and asked. In fact, we are planning to do something big. We are planning to give Xiao a surprise. Charles smiled meaningfully. Then he told Maura everyone's plan. After Maura heard this, she immediately expressed that she wanted to join in. Even if the CIA suspended her, it could not dissuade Maura from continuing to investigate Xiao. In the past, she was worried that she was weak and powerless, but now, her worries have become unnecessary. With Charles and his friends, many things will become much simpler. Well, Charles smiled even more happily. Maura, you are welcome to join us. Although Eric has always had a strong prejudice against ordinary people, he also has great trust in Maura and has not raised any objections. Mystique Raven, Beast Hank and other mutants also expressed their strong welcome to Maura after learning about this incident. From then on, Maura served as Charles's assistant, helping Charles to provide special training for the young mutants. Of course, Rorschach did not receive special training from Charles, because Rorschach is the only one who has perfect control over his abilities. Even if Charles wanted to teach, he had nothing to teach. While others were being drilled to death by Charles, Rorschach was training by himself in the gym. And this is a treatment that Eric has never had, because even Eric is being trained by Charles. The days in Xavier Manor have become in full swing and in full swing. I have to say that Charles is indeed extraordinary, and his knowledge of genetic variation is very profound. For all mutants, regardless of their abilities, Charles was able to formulate corresponding training strategies and achieve very obvious results. The nickname, Professor. In just 10 days, the mutants who participated in the special training have made very obvious progress. Although there is still a certain gap between the ability to master one's own abilities and even the combat level, compared with the original, it can still be described as renewed. Charles and Eric felt very relieved when they saw this. Everything is developing in a good direction. Charles. Magneto was being trained on the playground when Rorschach appeared. Charles and Magneto both stopped and looked over. Rorschach, it's really rare. Are you willing to give it up today? Magneto started teasing. During these days, Luo Xia locked himself in the training room for training every day, and basically saw no one. Let me review your training results. Luo Xia also teased with a smile. During these days, he and Charles Eric have become very familiar with each other, and unlike before, they still have a completely equal relationship. So Rorschach spoke much more casually. Then you came at the wrong time. I haven't surprised you yet. Eric spread his hands. The fact is that Eric's own abilities have been developed to a great extent, so it is more difficult than others to make progress. Charles introduced to Rorschach on the side. This is natural. Eric has been chasing Xiao alone for most of his life. His control of his own abilities is not comparable to that of other young mutants. Okay Charles, I have to go, the time is almost up. After talking a little, Rorschach spoke seriously to Charles and Eric. Last time at S.H.I.E.L.D., Howard Stark had said that he would invite Rorschach to his house for a simple meal. Rorschach thought that the other party was just talking, but he didn't expect that the playboy was serious. He really made a formal invitation to Rorschach. To develop a rich and powerful network like Howard Stark, Rorschach could not find any reason to refuse, so he agreed. Charles and Eric would naturally have no objection to this. They and Rorschach were just like-minded friends, not Rorschach's parents. They would not ask about Rorschach's private life, as long as Rorschach would not affect everyone. And Rorschach himself was exactly the person that Charles and Eric trusted the most. Rorschach, do you need a car? You can drive my car. Charles also suggested. Thank you, Charles. Maybe next time. Rorschach waved his hand and rejected Charles's kindness. He had a special car to pick him up for this appointment. After leaving Xavier Manor, Rorschach once again came to 75th Street in New York, the street where he and Jarvis separated last time. There, Jarvis was already waiting for Rorschach. But what Jarvis never knew was that he was not the only one waiting for Rorschach. Mr. Rorschach. Seeing Rorschach's figure appear, Jarvis, who was waiting in front of the car, immediately took the initiative to greet him and greeted him politely. Jarvis, have you been waiting for a long time? I just arrived too. Please get in the car, Mr. Rorschach. The banquet has been arranged. Jarvis went around to the other side and opened the door for Rorschach. It must be said that Howard Stark's butler looks more like a gentleman than Howard Stark in every aspect. Although Howard Stark is not young anymore, his playboy character has not changed much. Banquet, isn't it just a simple meal? Stark doesn't need to make it so grand. Rorschach glanced at Jarvis. Mr. Rorschach is Mr. Stark's savior, so he can't be too casual. Jarvis made a gesture to Rorschach to get in the car. What savior? That's too much. Rorschach shook his head and didn't say anything more. Howard Stark lacked everything except money, so he had a banquet, and he could take this opportunity to splurge. Sir, target found. Repeat, target found. Just when Rorschach was about to get in the car, he suddenly paused. Because Rorschach's super hearing had just caught a voice. Are you sure? A voice came from the receiver, with a hint of excitement. The similarity with the portrait is as high as 80%, which can be determined to be the target we are looking for. Very good. Keep an eye on the person. Understood, sir. This conversation ended just like that. Mr. Rorschach. Jarvis saw that Rorschach was a little dazed, and couldn't help but tentatively called out. Oh, it's okay. Rorschach waved his hand and got into the car as if nothing had happened. But at the same time, Rorschach was on guard. He immediately looked through the car window in the direction where the sound came from. As expected, he saw a capable young man in his 30s with a flat head, quietly staring at his direction in an inconspicuous corner. And after he got in the car, the other party also got in the car immediately. And after Jarvis started the car, the other car followed very stealthily not far away. Rorschach was sure that the target of that person was him. Who could it be? Rorschach fell into deep thought. To be honest, he had not been reborn in this world for a long time, and he had not offended anyone. Who would target him? But think about it again. Rorschach had killed saber-toothed tigers, red devils and rapids, and killed several werewolves. Okay, Rorschach took back his previous thoughts. It's just that it's been so long since the killing of saber-toothed tigers, and through Caliban, it's basically confirmed that Shao didn't find him. Could it be that the person targeting him was a werewolf? But would it be a bit inconsistent for werewolves to have a boss or not? Those guys have also developed a neat and strict organization. This shouldn't be the case. Rorschach apparently sat in his seat with his eyes closed, but he was calculating and analyzing in his mind. But after thinking about it, he didn't come to a definite conclusion, so he simply stopped thinking about it. When those guys jump out automatically, everything will be clear. 54th Street in New York. In a temporary command center. Stryker's face was full of excitement. He finally found that guy. The death of Sabertooth Tiger and Zero can be said to have always been on Stryker's mind. Naturally, Stryker spared no effort to conduct a vigorous investigation. But for some reason, except for that amusement park, the two murderers did not leave any traces. This made Stryker extremely annoyed. In the end, he could only helplessly decide to let it go. But who would have thought that after all the difficulties, there was a village with willows and flowers? Stryker unexpectedly got a very useful clue from Lucian. An Oriental young man who killed a werewolf with his bare hands. Although Stryker is not a mutant, he can be said to know mutants better than anyone else. In his cognition, most mutants are Westerners, and Orientals are very, very rare. At least Stryker has been dealing with mutants for so many years, and has never seen an Oriental face. In addition, both of them fight with fists and feet, so the direction is very obvious. Stryker ordered people to start investigating. And with the tavern where the incident occurred as the radius, plus all the interpersonal relationships of the other party, a large number of people began to be deployed to squat and investigate. The middle-aged man who went in and out of the tavern with Rorschach, the actual person in charge of the tavern, and Howard Stark who was saved by Rorschach, etc. They are all Rorschach's interpersonal relationships. They were all included in the monitoring range. And Jarvis, as Howard Stark's spokesperson, was not spared. However, the middle-aged man was transformed from Riven, and Caliban, the head of the tavern, was very sensitive. He moved immediately after the agent gunfight incident. Nothing could be found out at all. On the contrary, there was a major gain from Jarvis, who was not very hopeful, which was something Stryker had not expected. Finally found the person. Sir, I'll go and catch him now. The loyal Wade volunteered and stepped forward. Wait a minute, Wade. Stryker called Wade directly. You can't act alone this time. I will equip you with 2 tactical teams and you will command them. Sir, is that too exaggerated? Do you really think it's necessary? We are just going to catch someone, not to fight. Wade said speechlessly. Is the commander too concerned about that guy? It's just killing a saber-toothed tiger, what's the big deal? Wade, you are an important candidate for the X-weapon plan, and you can't afford to lose. I won't take any risks. Stryker naturally has his own reasons. So, do you really think I'm at risk of failure? Sir, I'm very sad. I thought you knew me well after so long, but now it seems that you don't know me well enough. Shut up, Wade, your mission this time is to bring the person to me while keeping yourself safe. Stryker didn't have time to talk nonsense with Wade. He interrupted Wade directly. If you can't bring the person, then, bring the serum. Anyway, for Stryker's research, the serum is enough. Of course, Stryker's first goal is not to kill Rorschach, but to find out the mutant organization behind Rorschach. But if things can't be done, you can only settle for the next best thing. The tail behind him has been following him for 3 blocks. It must be said that the opponent's tracking level is still very high. If there is no certain anti-reconnaissance ability, it is difficult to detect. For example, Jarvis, he did not notice any abnormality from beginning to end. It's just a pity that the opponent will never think that his every move is actually under Rorschach's control. Because Rorschach has already locked the opponent's heartbeat. Not only the heartbeat, but also the conversation between the opponent and the superior was heard clearly by Rorschach. Report the current position. Sir, the target is now heading north on 71st Street. I have sent a special operations team, and it is expected to meet you in 20 minutes. Keep an eye on it. Understood, sir. Special operations team. It's really exaggerated. Rorschach couldn't help but secretly sigh. No matter who the mastermind behind the scenes is, he thinks highly of himself. But with Rorschach's current skills, he is naturally fearless. It's just a pity that he might not be able to make it on time. Jarvis, please wait a moment, can you stop the car in front? Rorschach thought for a moment, sat up straight, and said to Jarvis. Mr. Rorschach, is there something wrong? Jarvis looked at Rorschach with a little confusion and asked. Jarvis, I suddenly remembered that I have something to deal with immediately, but don't worry, I will go there as soon as I finish it, but I may be a little late. But I will hurry up and try to be on time. Rorschach said to Jarvis with a serious face. Jarvis actually wanted to ask Rorschach what was so urgent that he had to deal with it at this critical moment, but he and Rorschach were not that familiar. Some things are not good to ask too much. Mr. Rorschach, is there anything I can help you with? I have been with Mr. Stark for so long, and I can still handle some small things. Jarvis thought about it and made a sincere suggestion to Rorschach. No need, this is my personal matter, and it's not a big deal, I'll take care of it. Rorschach waved his hand to Jarvis. Rorschach said so Jarvis naturally couldn't continue to ask. He pondered for a moment and continued to suggest, Mr. Rorschach, at least let me take you there, and when you've dealt with the matter, I'll take you to Mr. Stark. Thank you, Jarvis, I appreciate your kindness, but you don't have to be so troublesome. In that case, then okay, Mr. Rorschach, I'll explain the situation to Mr. Stark. Seeing Rorschach's firm attitude, Jarvis didn't say anything more, and according to what Rorschach said, he slowly stopped the car on the side of the road in front. Rorschach stopped talking nonsense, pushed the door open, and strode onto the street. As expected, as Rorschach got out of the car, the original Ford car also stopped on the side of the road immediately. The flat-headed young man also got out of the car immediately. He continued to follow Rorschach not far away. Rorschach pretended that he hadn't noticed anything and just walked in front of him as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until he followed him for 2 more streets that the young man with the flat head behind him realized that the target was walking to a more and more remote place. Could it be that the other party had already discovered him? It shouldn't be. The young man with the flat head began to recall the whole process carefully, and didn't find anything wrong. It seemed that he was too suspicious. Beep beep. There was a horn behind him. The young man with the flat head looked back and found that 5 special agent cars were lined up in front and back, and were driving forward very domineeringly. The young man with the flat head made a gesture to the special agents in those cars. The target is in front. Okay, start working. In the front car, Wade, who was sitting in the passenger seat, quickly found Rorschach after a simple investigation of the scene. Several cars drove straight ahead and blocked Rorschach's way by the side of the road. Tap tap tap. Then the car door opened, and a total of 20 fully armed special agents got out of 5 cars and surrounded Rorschach. Each special agent held an assault rifle in his hand, and the muzzle was pointed at Rorschach. Stryker. Rorschach glanced at the scene, especially when he saw a chatterbox among them. How could he not understand who was messing with him? I know. Wade's voice sounded, and this guy strode towards Rorschach from the encirclement of those special agents. You must be very curious. Who are these guys? What do they want to do? Will they kill me? Blah blah. Without Stryker's suppression, Wade's true nature began to be exposed again, and he talked endlessly. Let me clear your mind for you. About a month ago, you killed a beast in an amusement park in Ohio. Remember? Of course, it wasn't a real beast, but a person who looked like a beast. I think you will understand even if I don't explain it, right? You are so long-winded. Rorschach couldn't help but interrupt Wade. At this time, he understood a little why Sun Wukong wanted to kill Tang Seng in A Chinese Odyssey. It turns out that long-windedness can really cost people's lives. Just now, he really felt a group of mosquitoes buzzing in his ears. Let's be simple and direct. You tell me your purpose, and then I'll decide whether to kill you. Don't waste each other's time, okay? Rorschach was much cleaner and more straightforward. I'm talking. You interrupted me, okay. You didn't deny killing the beast just now, which means you admitted it, right? Wade was talking excitedly, and was interrupted, and was very unhappy. At this point, is it still meaningful for me to admit or deny it? Rorschach couldn't help but sneered. God, Wade, he's right, stop talking nonsense, and complete the task cleanly and neatly, okay? Even Stryker, who was sitting in the command center, couldn't listen to it anymore, and scolded Wade in the communication channel. Wade swallowed the nonsense back into his stomach. Okay, you need to go with us. Is it simple and direct enough now? Go. If I go with you, will you take your left foot first or your right foot first? Rorschach looked at Wade with a very serious look. Wade was confused. What's the difference? He thought about it, but couldn't figure out why he was so bothered by such an insignificant thing. But seeing Rorschach's serious look, he didn't seem to be joking. Then, right foot, Wade answered tentatively. Sorry, I don't like people who take the right foot first, so I'll just kill you. Rorschach's eyes turned red. This is not good. Wade's pupils shrank suddenly. Rorschach's eyes at this moment, aren't they exactly the same as the guy whose eyes could emit lasers that he caught a while ago? Could this guy's eyes also emit lasers? Swish. The next moment, 2 extremely blazing heat rays shot towards Wade. A sense of crisis of death came immediately. At such a close distance, Wade couldn't even dodge. But Wade was Stryker's top warrior after all, and his strength was also at the cheating level. When a group of people were firing submachine guns at close range, they could split all the bullets with 2 swords. It wouldn't be so easy for Rorschach to kill this guy. Clang! The sound of metal and iron rang out, and it was Wade who pulled out a long sword on his back. Just stretched it in front of him. Bang! Rorschach's 2 heat rays shot directly at Wade's sword. Then a huge force acted on the long sword, and the long sword hit Wade's chest hard under the impact. Wade flew backwards. He fell to the ground like a dead dog. Rorschach's heat ray did not stop, and continued to chase Wade to cut, but Wade was as flexible as a monkey, jumping up and down, dodging left and right. Although it was very thrilling, he managed to temporarily avoid Rorschach's attack. So can Rorschach shoot Wade to death within 5 seconds? No one knows. Rorschach is sure that he can definitely defeat Wade if the time is a little longer, but 5 seconds is still a bit short to be honest. What's more, Stryker's other special agents are not vegetarians either. Chee. Several sounds of breaking through the air came, but several tranquilizer bullets were shot at Rorschach from several different directions. The speed of tranquilizer bullets is much slower than that of ordinary bullets. Rorschach's current supervision and motion capture can be said to be able to see it clearly. And his body reaction can also completely keep up with this speed. So Rorschach did not dodge, but just quickly swept his hands in front of him. Those tranquilizer bullets were completely caught in Rorschach's hands. Ha ha. Then Rorschach looked at the special agents who shot at him, sneered, and shook his hands and shot forward. Chee. Rorschach used the tranquilizer bullets as darts and threw them directly. Whoosh. Several tranquilizer bullets flashed in the air and turned into blurred shadows. Its power was even greater than that fired from the tranquilizer gun. Several special agents did not react at all and were directly hit by tranquilizer bullets. Not only that, the huge force from the tranquilizer bullets actually knocked several special agents who were shot to the ground. It seemed that those people were not hit by tranquilizer bullets, but shotguns. Gudong. The sound of swallowing saliva sounded, and the special agents around were all dumbfounded. Even if they knew they were dealing with mutants, this was too exaggerated, right? As the core force of Stryker, they had seen mutants before. In fact, Stryker's island held a large number of mutants. Although many of those mutants had various abilities, their combat effectiveness was generally not that strong, and most of them did not even have any combat effectiveness. For example, saber-toothed tigers could help Stryker hunt other mutants, which showed the strength of mutants at this stage. It was rare to see someone as tough as Rorschach. Whoosh! A sound of breaking through the air sounded. It was Wade who had adjusted his state during this time, holding two swords and quickly killing Rorschach. His two swords flashed with a cold light, carrying an extremely sharp momentum, and slashed at Rorschach fiercely. With Rorschach's current speed, it was impossible for Wade to hit him. He shook his body, unfolded his super speed, and avoided Wade's two swords in an instant. Ding dang! The opponent's two swords slashed the ground together, splashing a few sparks. At the same time, Rorschach had moved behind Wade. His iron fists began to hit Wade fiercely. Once he hit, Wade would definitely be like the werewolves in the tavern, smashed in the chest by Rorschach and died. But Wade is not an ordinary person after all. This guy seemed to have eyes on his back. With a flip of his right hand, the long sword went straight back, pointing directly at Rorschach's heart. In this case, Rorschach naturally couldn't continue to move forward. This guy could be said to be a must-see for attacking Rorschach, so Rorschach had to dodge. And Wade also made adjustments again with the help of this lightning moment, turned around, and continued to kill Rorschach with his two swords. Deadpool is worthy of it. Rorschach couldn't help but show approval in his eyes. Wade's skills were really too agile, especially the two swords in his hands, which were played out of variety. Even if Rorschach has reached a speed of nearly 80 meters per second, it is difficult to kill Wade in a short time. After all, no matter how fast Rorschach is, can he be faster than a bullet? Wade can even hit a bullet, so he can naturally keep up with Rorschach's speed. The most convenient way to kill Wade is actually Heat Ray, but it is a pity that Rorschach cannot use Heat Ray at will at this stage. Of course, this does not mean that Rorschach is not Wade's opponent. After all, there is still a big gap in absolute strength between the two sides. There is no doubt that Rorschach can kill Wade. It's just a little more troublesome. Well, I can only say that Victor died unjustly. While Rorschach secretly praised Wade, Wade also admired Rorschach very much. As a master swordsman, Wade could tell that Rorschach's fighting skills were extremely shabby and had no rules at all. But even so, Wade was overwhelmed by the opponent. This can only mean one thing. The opponent's physical fitness is too strong, even much stronger than the saber-toothed tiger. In fact, if the saber-toothed tiger didn't have that terrifying self-healing ability, Wade wouldn't be able to kill it just by relying on its beast-like strength and explosive power. If you die later, it won't be unjust either. Rorschach raised an eyebrow at Wade, then set his gaze on a tree next to him. The corner of his mouth curled up. "You have weapons, but I am empty-handed. Isn't this fair?" said. Luo Sha hugged the poplar tree as thick as a thigh with both hands and pulled it up with force. Click, click, click. The soil on the ground turned up and formed piles of waves. Under the stunned gaze of everyone, Luo Sha actually pulled out the tree. Hoo ho ho. He just waved it like a stick in his hand a few times. Don't tell me, it was extremely smooth. Wade, you're right, it's not fair. Wade was stunned for a moment, and then ruthlessly launched his accusation against Rorschach. But Rorschach was too lazy to pay attention to Wade. He hugged the roots of the poplar tree with both hands, used the entire poplar tree as a wishful golden cudgel, and hit Wade hard. Even though the poplar tree is so huge and visually exaggerated, considering Rorschach's current strength, it takes no effort at all to swing this thing. Hoo ho ho. The whole tree danced vigorously in Rorschach's hands. Shet. Wade looked at the tree crown that was constantly enlarging in his pupils, and couldn't help but let out a low curse. Not caring about anything else, he immediately dodged to one side in embarrassment. There was no way. How could Wade deal with such a huge fan with intertwined branches? Even if his bullets could block dozens of bullets fired at him instantly, they would not be able to deal with an attack from such a large tree crown. After all, Wade couldn't cut off the entire tree crown with one sword. I can only dodge in embarrassment. Boom! The huge tree crown hit the ground hard, shaking the entire earth. It's very flexible. Rorschach raised the poplar tree in his hand again and shrugged at Wade, but how many times can you dodge? Rorschach admitted that it was his first time to use such a strange weapon, so he was not very comfortable with it. But after the first adaptation, Rorschach believed that filming Wade would be much easier. That's right, just shoot. Isn't the huge tree crown in Rorschach's hand equivalent to a fly swatter? Wade, isn't he just a fly that Rorschach needs to swat? In this case, no matter how fancy Wade's swordsmanship is, what's the use of his advanced fighting skills? It's just a dimensionality reduction attack, and I won't make any sense to you. Of course, Rorschach's method still has a fatal flaw, that is, Wade cannot get close. Once Wade gets close, Rorschach will stop working and the canopy will be completely useless. Wade obviously understood this. After escaping the first wave of attacks from the tree crown, he quickly writhed on the ground and ran towards Rorschach like a monkey. It's just a pity that Wade's ideals are plump, but the reality is skinny. There is a big gap in absolute strength between him and Rorschach, and it cannot be made up for by superb combat skills. Laugh. Rorschach shot a heat ray towards Wade. Wade didn't dare to attack the heat ray. At the critical moment, he immediately jumped to the side. But Rorschach's flyswatter was already there waiting. Boom. He just took the photo from the head, covering Wade's whole body underneath. Then Rorschach casually placed one side of the tree root in his hand on the ground and stepped lightly on it with his feet. Wade was suppressed under the tree by Rorschach. It was as if Monkey Sun was trapped under the Wuji mountain, unable to break free no matter what. You are just bullying people. It's not fair. It's not fair. Wade's labored voice came from under the canopy. Not to mention how miserable he was now. His body was scratched and stabbed by branches and trunks in many places, and his body was dripping with blood. Of course, these are secondary. What really hurt Wade was the huge impact from the tree crown. It was like being hit by a huge boulder, and several of Wade's ribs were broken. At this time, Rorschach looked at Wade's eyes, but they had turned red again. This time, Wade couldn't escape no matter what. Shot. Shot. But the special agents sent by Stryker around them were not just for nothing. Seeing that Wade was taken care of in a matter of seconds, how could they remain calm? Choo-choo-choo. Choo-choo-choo. The special agents began to face Rorschach and pull the triggers in their hands mercilessly. A hail of bullets covered Rorschach. Rorschach's current physical fitness is not that abnormal, and he is still unable to ignore this level of firepower attack. He had to temporarily abandon Wade, put all his strength into his feet, and stepped hard. Click. A pit appeared directly on the ground, and Rorschach's body was ejected to one side like a cannonball. With advanced prediction and quick dodge, Rorschach successfully dodged the wave of bullets and moved behind the bunker. In front of a car parked on the side of the road. Then, Rorschach stretched out his hand and easily lifted the car up, blocking it in front of him. Dang dang dang. Dang dang dang. For a time, countless bullets hit the car, which was riddled with holes. Wade, who was pinned under the tree canopy by Rorschach, had taken advantage of this moment to escape. Laugh. But he had just crawled out from under the tree canopy, and before he could stand up straight, a heat ray shot over from the side. It directly pierced Wade's heart. Shit, did I really die here? That guy was right, I did not die unjustly. Wade looked at the big hole in his chest, his eyes widening. After saying these words, the person fell directly to the ground. How weird, even his last words before death were so different. Rorschach couldn't help but secretly complain in his heart. However, at this time, Rorschach had used heat rays 3 times, and although the time of each time was very short, the cumulative effect was almost at its limit. Rorschach's eyes were now very uncomfortable, with some burning and some dull pain. But he couldn't continue to shoot those ordinary special agents. But this was actually not a problem for Rorschach. To deal with those ordinary special agents, why would he need heat rays? He just grabbed the car with both hands, held it in front as a sandbag, and began to rush towards those special agents with great dominance. For those special agents, once Rorschach got close to them, they would lose all their advantages. They could only become lambs to be slaughtered. Because once Rorschach got close to them, they couldn't shoot so recklessly. After all, compared to killing Rorschach, the possibility of killing their own people would be greater. Quick, stop him. You must stop him. The captain of the other team shouted at his team members. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. The bullets were getting denser and denser. However, it was useless. A car weighing more than a ton was nothing to Rorschach. He quickly rushed to the front of the armed special agents. Bang! He kicked the car in front of him directly, and then the huge thing was like a boulder, smashing towards those people. The special agents felt their scalps tingling and began to dodge, but they couldn't dodge it just because they wanted to. Several special agents were smashed into pulp by the car on the spot. Whoosh! Boom! When the car hit the scene, Rorschach himself used his super jumping power to jump over a distance of several meters. Like a god of war, it fell on the scene. A special agent was directly trampled on the chest by Rorschach. Boom! He casually punched a special agent next to him. The other person was launched like a cannonball and hit the wall on the side. A ball of plasma exploded. The man's head smashed against the wall like a watermelon and exploded. But in fact, before his head was exploded, this man had been hammered to death by Rorschach. Rorschach was so terrifying and powerful that all the special agents at the scene were scared to death. Ah! A special agent let out a beast-like roar, screamed, tightened his grip on the gun in his hand, and started to pull the trigger on Rorschach. Aha! But the moment the bullet came out of the chamber, Rorschach had already rushed to the side first, and the special agent's bullet immediately missed. Boom! Immediately afterwards, the special agent felt a strong force hit him, and then the others flew directly up. After that, there is no more. The agent's eyes turned completely black. Bang! There was a loud noise, but Rorschach tore off the door of the car he smashed out, held it in his hand as a shield, and rushed into the special agents again. Bang bang bang! Bang bang bang! Gunshots began to ring out one after another, mixed with screams one after another. With the shield in hand, Rorschach is even more powerful. Even if he accidentally fails to dodge and a bullet hits him, he will be blocked by the car door immediately. That's all. Under the attack of all the special agents, he killed 7 in and 7 out. In just a few minutes, except for Rorschach, there was no one left standing at the scene. They all went back underground to see their dear grandma. Wade, please reply quickly. What's going on at the scene? Wade, please reply if you hear me. Smith, please reply. In the quiet scene, only Stryker's anxious voice came from the walkie-talkies carried by a few special agents. Rorschach smiled softly, picked up the walkie-talkie from one of the special agents, and said to Stryker, Wade is dead. It won't be long before you will go down to accompany him. Click. Before Stryker could say anything else, Rorschach smashed the walkie-talkie into crumbs. Inside the temporary command center, Stryker's expression suddenly became extremely ugly, as if someone had slapped him hard several times. How can he still not understand that all the men he sent have been wiped out? You underestimated the enemy. Rorschach killed the saber-toothed tiger and could easily hammer the werewolf to death. Stryker originally felt that he had paid enough attention to the other party. Not only did they send Wade, they also assigned a 20-man special operations team to the opponent. This lineup is not unpowerful, it can even be said to be exaggerated. I thought everything was safe, but in the end, how long has it been? Just give it all up. Stryker developed a deep fear of Rorschach. It seems that only X weapons can deal with that guy. Weapon X must be developed as soon as possible. Stryker secretly made a decision in his heart. But when he thought of this, Stryker also felt extremely headache. So far, there are only two candidates for Weapon X, namely Logan and Wade. Fortunately for Wade, he has already agreed to conduct experiments on Weapon X. There is no problem and it can be carried out at any time. But it was more troublesome for Logan. It was impossible for the other party to agree to participate in this transformation experiment. However, the transformation of X weapons must be carried out voluntarily by the person being transformed, and cannot be forced. But that guy Logan has long had a prejudice against Stryker and would never agree to it no matter what. So Stryker used Silver Fox and Sabertooth Tiger to arrange a game specifically for Wolverine, a game that made Wolverine willingly participate in the experiment. But before the net could be closed, the saber-toothed tiger was killed by Rorschach. And now, Wade has also been killed by Rorschach. Stryker's balls hurt so much that they almost shattered. But now, it was not the time to think about these things. Stryker immediately called the special agents around him and hurriedly left the temporary command center. How to deal with this mess will be discussed in the long term when we return, but it can be expected that Stryker will be very busy in the future. The other side. I hope it's not too late now. Rorschach took off his coat, which was stained with blood, and murmured in a low voice. Although it didn't take him too long to kill Wade and the others, taxis in this era were not easy to get. You didn't know how long you would have to wait for a taxi. What's more, in order to make it easier for him to flex his muscles, Rorschach deliberately found a very remote place. Of course, Stryker's special agents and some special agent vehicles were parked on the roadside. They were intact and technically drivable, but Rorschach had no intention of touching them. There were so many people dead on the street, and the ones who died were secret agents of the military. Rorschach would only cause trouble for himself unless he was mentally disturbed. So, Howard Stark can only be wrong. Playboy has been waiting for others all his life, and he has never waited for others, right? Rorschach can be regarded as providing Howard Stark with a new life experience. Throwing his coat on the ground and about to leave, Rorschach suddenly remembered something and picked up his coat again. He walked towards the car he used as a sledgehammer. The fuel tank of the car had been broken long ago, and gasoline was flowing out. Rorschach wet his clothes with gasoline, and then shot out a heat ray. The clothes suddenly burned. Done. No clues will be left. At this time, Rorschach's super hearing heard footsteps approaching, and he didn't say anything nonsense, and he was super fast, and he disappeared in a flash. Go to keep the appointment with Howard Stark. As for Stryker, Rorschach temporarily put him behind his mind. After all, Rorschach has not yet unlocked the ability to fly, and his super hearing cannot reach that far, so there is no way to find Stryker for the time being. But this is not a big deal. Anyway, Rorschach knows that Stryker has a secret base on an island, where many mutants are imprisoned. When another brainwave enhancer is built in Xavier Manor, won't it be easy to find Stryker? When the time comes, just destroy the opponent's nest. Rorschach has a plan in mind. By the time Rorschach appeared in front of Howard Stark's mansion, it was almost 2 hours later. It was a full hour late from the agreed time. Howard Stark has never been let off like this, right? Rorschach couldn't help but think with some evil humor. However, the incident happened suddenly. Who would have thought that Stryker would send people to attack Rorschach at this time? This is indeed not Rorschach's fault. Ding dong. After adjusting her mood, Luo Shah reached out and pressed the doorbell in front of the compound. After a while, Jarvis' figure appeared. Mr. Rorschach, you are finally here. Mr. Stark is still waiting for you. Jarvis hurriedly opened the door for Rorschach, with a thankful look on his face. I'm really sorry, Jarvis, I was delayed because of trivial matters. Mr. Stark, is he okay? Rorschach asked casually while following Jarvis forward. Nothing was broken, no yelling, and considering the circumstances, I think it's pretty good. Jarvis thought for a moment, and then said to Rorschach seriously. Rorschach, Jarvis, I suddenly don't want to come to the appointment. Is it still too late for me to regret it? Mr. Rorschach, Mr. Stark will not eat you. While the two were talking, Jarvis took Rorschach to Howard Stark's mansion. The playboy stood up and complained. Luo Shaw, I have met with dignitaries, military bosses, and business giants, but you are the first one to make me wait for such a long time. Quote. Then I'm really flattered. Sorry, I was late to deal with some emergencies. It doesn't matter. I've been waiting anyway. Besides, who asked you to save me? Howard Stark personally welcomed Rorschach in, and then ordered Jarvis, tell the kitchen to start preparations. In fact, Howard Stark's banquet had been prepared a long time ago, but after waiting for Rorschach for a long time, he still didn't come, so this guy had to retreat for the time being. Wait until Rorschach comes to prepare again. It can only be said that rich people are bold when they take action. Mr. Stark, I saved you as a big favor, and it can't be repaid with just one meal. Rorschach said half jokingly and half seriously as he followed Howard Stark inside. Just kidding, it's not easy to make Howard Stark owe a favor, but you have to take it seriously. Haha, of course, this meal is just to express my gratitude, nothing more. Howard Stark smiled and said, come on, let me show you around my home first. I wish I could have it. Rorschach was very interested. Whether it was in his previous life or this life, Rorschach had never been to the mansion of a wealthy man like Howard Stark, and this time it was an eye-opener. Let's take a look at my storage room first. I have a lot of good stuff here. Howard Stark brought Rorschach to a very luxurious room with a hint of show-off. Trench. Inhumane. This was Rorschach's first reaction when he entered the storage room. This is like a small museum, okay. All kinds of famous paintings, antiques, famous wines and watches are piled up in every corner like groceries. That's called randomness. Giotto's The Kiss of Judas mainly shows us the moment of psychological confrontation between Jesus Christ and Judas. Frankly speaking, I don't like this painting too much. It's too heavy. But you know, there are some gifts that you can't refuse even if you don't like them. You even have to pretend that you like them. Oh, the Great Sword of Scotland, men's favorite. As expected, Rorschach, you also like it better. Man, who doesn't like sharp weapons? Yes, this old antique is the world's first bicycle. Although it looks very crude now, it was the crystallization of wisdom at the time. Howard Stark saw where Rorschach's eyes fell, and introduced Rorschach from the side. As expected, as Luo Shaw expected, the things inside were all rare treasures, which amazed Luo Shaw. Come on, I'll show you my garage again. After showing off his various collections, Playboy happily brought Rorschach to his luxurious garage. Luxury cars of various colors and styles were lined up in 2 long rows, making people wonder if this was a 4S store. How about Rorschach? These are the treasures I have collected in the past 15 years, and they are all here. Howard Stark's eyes shone brightly, and he began to introduce his dazzling luxury cars to Rorschach like a treasure trove. Cadillac V16 has been out of production for 40 years. This is the world's first mass-produced model with a 16-cylinder engine. I spent a lot of effort to get it. In front of a red roadster, Howard Stark showed off to Rorschach again. But Rorschach didn't take it too seriously. Due to the limitations of the times, frankly speaking, in Rorschach's eyes, the cars of this era are extremely old-fashioned and scummy. A special energy source detected. But at this moment, the notification sound from the system suddenly sounded in Rorschach's mind. This made Rorschach stunned for a moment. At the same time, Rorschach's vision was transformed into a computer scan-like vision by the system. In that vision, the Cadillac that Howard Stark was vigorously introducing was marked by a digital projection. A red dot flickered on it. Obviously, the special energy source mentioned by the system was inside that Cadillac. Special energy source. What does that mean? Rorschach couldn't help but ask in confusion, but unfortunately, the system didn't respond as usual. Energy source analysis. Energy value. 37 origin points. Status, unextractable. This series of prompts confused Rorschach again. The energy value is actually measured by origin points, and it is still shown as unextractable. Doesn't this mean that there is also a state where it can be extracted? Then if it is extracted, can the origin points be directly replenished? It must be like this. Rorschach's eyes lit up directly. After all, the logic in it is still very simple and not difficult to understand. The only thing that Rorschach could not understand for the time being was why this energy source was in an unextractable state. And why would there be any energy source hidden in a car? Although Rorschach did not quite understand what the energy source identified by the system was, he was sure that it was definitely not the fuel of the car, otherwise it would be too low. And the energy of fuel is everywhere on the street, so it is not special. Rorschach, it seems that you also like this car very much. I didn't expect that we have the same taste. Seeing Rorschach staring at the Cadillac, Howard Stark couldn't help but laugh. He also made a suggestion with great interest. Do you want to try it yourself? You know, after the meal, I can let you drive this car for a ride and feel it yourself. Really, Mr. Stark? Of course, it's no big deal. That's great, I'm looking forward to it. Rorschach agreed without hesitation. It just so happened that he wanted to take the opportunity to study carefully what was so special about this car. Mr. Stark, Mr. Rorschach, the banquet is ready. At this time, the loyal butler Jarvis came to the two of them and said to them, "Well, Rorschach, let's go to dinner first." Howard Stark patted Rorschach on the shoulder and took Rorschach to his luxurious restaurant. Rorschach looked around and saw a good guy. When Jarvis told him that Howard Stark had prepared a banquet, Rorschach actually had no idea, but now he saw it and it was really eye-opening. The table was full of dishes, so dazzling and overwhelming. Rorschach couldn't name most of the dishes, but roughly estimated that there must be 20 to 30 dishes. Even the tableware was placed in a long row in front of Rorschach. Well, Rorschach didn't like Western food in his previous life and didn't study it much. He only knew that Western food had a lot of red tape and that there were certain tablewares for different dishes. This made Rorschach a little dumbfounded. He didn't know how to use it at all. Rorschach, I think you must be hungry too, please enjoy it. Howard Stark, who was opposite, said to Rorschach after inviting Rorschach to sit down. Okay, since he didn't know how to use it, he just ignored it. Tableware and the like, just use it as you like, why bother so much? Rorschach picked up a set of tableware casually, completely ignoring the Western food, and started chatting with Howard Stark while eating. Howard also saw that Rorschach didn't understand Western food culture at all, but this playboy himself didn't pay much attention to some rules and regulations. In addition, Rorschach was obviously not an ordinary person, so Howard Stark didn't look down on Rorschach for this. The atmosphere at the table was still very harmonious. By the way, Rorschach, forgive me for offending you, can I ask how you got this extraordinary power? Seeing that the time was almost up, Howard Stark just asked the question he had always wanted to ask. This question was not only of concern to Peggy Carter, but Howard Stark himself was also very curious. After all, the Strategic Scientific Corps, the predecessor of S.H.I.E.L.D., was originally established for the purpose of studying super soldiers. Howard Stark was one of the main researchers. Agent Carter asked me this question before, and I have already answered it. I was born with it. Rorschach spread his hands. Okay, Rorschach, if you don't want to say it, I can understand. This is indeed your personal privacy. Howard Stark thought that Rorschach was deliberately concealing it. I was a little abrupt. Rorschach did not explain anything to Howard Stark. Anyway, he was telling the truth. Whether others believe it or not has nothing to do with him. Then Howard Stark did not delve into this issue with Rorschach, but turned to talk about other things. Howard Stark himself, needless to say, has knowledge far beyond that of ordinary people. Rorschach certainly does not have such deep knowledge, but as a reborn person, his vision is not covered. The two sides chatted speculatively. Rorschach, I really didn't expect you to be so impressive. Howard Stark couldn't help but show admiration. Although Rorschach is young, his insights on some things are more thorough and forward-looking than many industry elites. This is a talent. Overall, the banquet was a great success. After having enough food and drink, Howard Stark went to the reception room to sit for a while, and then he took Rorschach to the garage again. As promised before, he handed the key of the Cadillac to Rorschach. Rorschach, let me confirm again that you have a driver's license, okay? When Rorschach was about to start the car, Howard Stark couldn't help but ask again. Don't worry, Mr. Stark, I'm an experienced driver. Rorschach smiled lightly, started the car smoothly, and drove out of the garage very skillfully and drove onto the road outside. Because Rorschach knew how to drive in his previous life, he was completely proficient after just a few attempts after rebirth. He had driven Charles's car before, so his driving skills were no problem. Squeak, squeak. A cool red convertible supercar just raced on the street. Luxury cars and handsome guys are very attractive in any era. I don't know how many passionate eyes came over along the way. If Rorschach wanted to, he could easily take a beautiful woman away. But now, Rorschach didn't have those thoughts. His entire attention was almost entirely on this car. After driving 2 or 3 streets in a row, Rorschach still didn't find anything unusual about this car. After his inspection, it was just an ordinary car. Rorschach fell into deep thought. Could it be that the situation of this car was like in Fast and Furious 5 Inches, where there was nothing on the surface, but there was actually something hidden inside the car? However, when Rorschach got out of the car and carefully checked it inside and out, he also didn't find anything unusual. Entering the system to ask what the special energy source was, the cold system still didn't respond. This made Rorschach a little bit upset. You can't just return the car without any gain, right? Rorschach was definitely unwilling. It seems that he has to find a way to keep this car in his hands for a longer time. Even, let this car belong to him directly. In other words, buy the car from Howard Stark. Because Rorschach is ready to dismantle the car. Of course, Rorschach doesn't have money at the moment, but with his skills, it's actually very easy to make money. Buying is not a problem. But think about the fact that he and Howard Stark have just met, and the other party has obviously shown a great love for this car, which will be a very embarrassing request. But now, he can only bite the bullet and try. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe more.